guide us and help us ultimately to hear what you need us to hear. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. So I'll do a quick introduction of myself. I know most of you, so if you didn't get enough sleep last night, this is your good chance to just take a real quick nap. My name is Graham Standish. I am the Executive Director of Samaritan Counseling Guidance and Consulting. If you've not ever actually known where our main offices are, you've actually passed by our main offices to get here. Our main offices are in the White House across the parking lot on the third floor. We are also a counseling center that has satellites throughout Western Pennsylvania, Washington, Upper St. Clair, obviously Swickley, Rochester, Beaver, Butler, and Gibsonia. And I am also the director of our Caring for Clergy and Congregations program. That was a big part of my coming to Samaritan, was the opportunity to work with pastors and to work with churches on how to help grow in whatever ways. I mean, it can be numerically, but it can also be in health. It can be in other areas. I come to this position. I was a pastor of a growing church, Calvin Presbyterian Church in Zelienople, Pennsylvania, for 22 years. But also before that, I was a therapist with adolescents and children in a psychiatric hospital. I've been a drug and alcohol therapist, a marital and family therapist. And also, my PhD is in spiritual formation, and so I've been a spiritual director now for 35 years. And a lot of the work I do with pastors and churches is really an integration of therapy and coaching and spiritual direction, but also actual experience in turning around churches, turning around organizations. What we're going to be talking about today is really applying cognitive behavioral therapy to leadership. One of the things that I've often said to people when people have asked me, well, how did you know how to do what you did in turning around churches or turning around organizations? And often I've said is, I think about 60% of it comes from my background as a therapist and my training in my master's in social work. A lot of what I've done is an amalgamation of systems theory, because I've been trained as a marital and family therapist, group therapy, individual therapy, but it's also in taking concepts like cognitive behavioral therapy and applying it to myself and my own leadership. And as a result, being able to reduce conflict or actually move away from conflict in healthy ways before the conflict happens. And so one of the things that I have been doing since I've come to Samaritan has been offering workshops once or twice a year on how to integrate ideas coming from outside of ministry into ministry. And so for those of you who've taken workshops with me before, you know that often it is bringing ideas from therapy into leadership, but it's also bringing ideas from the field of spiritual formation in, from areas of I've done very intensive studies in leadership development and organizational psychology, and it's really integrating a lot of those. And so what I want to do today is to really open you up to this concept of cognitive behavioral therapy and to really kind of give you an understanding of both what it is and also to help you start, not complete, but help you start to develop these skills so that you can apply them to yourself and your own leadership so that ultimately you have a better understanding of how to move people forward. I'll give sort of my quick definition of cognitive behavioral therapy. It is a form of therapy that has evolved over the years, and I'll talk a little bit about the evolution in a second. It has evolved over the years, really starting out of other fields that they have brought them together. Cognitive behavioral therapy is considered the most effective form of therapy among counselors. That doesn't mean it's the only form of therapy, and it doesn't mean it's the only appropriate form of therapy. Just like we have a lot of different denominations. In the counseling field, there are a lot of different sects and thoughts on what is the best therapy. I will say at Samaritan, we're very intentional about bringing all sorts of people with different therapeutic perspectives into what we do. And so we have Gestalt therapists, Jungian therapists, psychodynamic therapists, narrative therapists, acceptance, and I can't remember what ACT, the initials stand for right off the bat. But their foundation is always cognitive behavioral therapy, because especially in the beginning, it is one of the most effective forms of therapy. And in my experience, has a lot to do with how to be effective also as a leader when we apply them to us. So, with all that being said, I want to start by just sharing 3 statements I have heard over the course of my ministry pastors saying. Number 1, we just had a terrible council meeting. I guess the honeymoon period is over. I don't know how many of you have ever used that honeymoon is over, but a lot have. It's like usually the first sign of things didn't go my way. Or what we hear is, they said they wanted someone to lead them in a new direction. Why did they lie to me? I've heard a lot of pastors say that. You know, when I was interviewing, they said this, but they're not doing that. Or they just don't want to follow where I'm leading them. These are actually quite common statements, especially in the mainline church. We say them all the time to each other. We say them to ourselves. We hear professors in seminary say something similar. We hear other people talk about it. So what's wrong with them? Because there is something seriously wrong with every one of these statements. And the answer is, every single one of them is a cognitive distortion. You're going to learn what cognitive distortions are. But every single one of them is a cognitive distortion. What do I mean by that? Well, number 1, ministry isn't marriage. The church is not our spouse. And treating them like they are, as though there should be a honeymoon, is actually a cognitive distortion, because you're taking something that isn't, you may be using it as an analogy, but it's actually not an effective analogy, and it creates a narrative that becomes self-destructive. Now, you don't have to agree with me, but I will say, wait until your final decision on what I'm saying for the end, because you may find by the end you agree with me. When you say, they lied to me, well, there is no single they in a church. The church is a collection of many people who all have different perspectives. To pretend that the church is one person actually impedes your ministry, because there is no one single they. Just as, right here, if I said, all pastors think this, do you think I would be right in that statement, whatever I said afterwards? My guess is, if you all got into a big conversation, you'd find a lot of you really don't agree with each other on a lot of things. And then you agree with each other also on a lot of things. You are not a they. You are representative of a lot of different thoughts, a lot of different training. Also, leadership is never all in or all out, but a matter of many in and some out. So when we say they don't want to do this, you know, often what I'll say is, wait, you polled the whole congregation? You polled the whole congregation? And they'll go, well, no. No, it's just actually my board doesn't want to do it. And I'll go, so you've done a poll of everybody on your board. Well, no, it's actually John and Sarah who don't want to do it. I said, so really what you're saying is your whole church doesn't want to do it, but it's really John and Sarah who are just powerful figures in your church. They don't want to do it. That's the problem, though, because as long as we're saying they don't want to do it, we're following a cognitive distortion. When we think in these ways, we actually become guilty of one or more of a number of what are called thought distortions. And I'm going to go into more detail of these later. But when we think these ways, we become guilty of black and white thinking, or of overgeneralizing, or of emotional reasoning, or shoulding, as in the statement, they're shoulding all over me. Catastrophizing, filtering, blaming, mind reading, and a number of other thought distortions that you're going to learn about today. So ultimately, to me, it is important to understand cognitive behavioral therapy and the concepts of it in our leadership, because it teaches us how to look at everything we're doing, which can also include our marriages, which can also include our relationships with other people. It can include an awful lot of other things that when we learn these things, what you find is it begins to change your perceptions on everything. The basic thing to understand is that cognitive behavioral therapy really focuses on the cycle of thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and how they all interact with each other. And by the way, in case you all didn't know it, you do have copies of all the slides in your folders here this morning. So if you want something to take notes on, they're there for you. So let's dig in. I want to start by digging into what cognitive behavioral... Oh, but before I go, several things. We will be taking a break here. I do want to introduce Rachel Fagan. Say hi, everybody. Rachel is our life coach, and at the very end, I think about the last 30 minutes or so, Rachel will actually be moving into talking about something called positive intelligence, which is coming out of the positive psychology movement, which is really grounded significantly in cognitive behavioral therapy. And I just want you to get to know her, introduce her, because while I am available to do coaching or consultations or anything with people, Rachel is our life coach, and she is fantastic and is really great at what she does and really integrates cognitive behavioral therapy into a lot of what she does, and she's really good at it. She has a teaching background, and what you're going to find is a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy actually entails teaching. It entails challenging thinking and teaching new ways and new patterns. So what is cognitive behavioral therapy? The first thing cognitive behavioral therapy does is it recognizes that we all have beliefs about ourselves, others in the world, that determine what we see, think, and feel, and how we respond and behave. Whether you know it or not, you all have beliefs about the way the world works. And you follow those beliefs. Every single one of you does. It may be a mixture of your family background. It may be a mixture of your cultural background. It may be a mixture of your theological training or your denominational training or your experiences. But whatever it is, at the core of you, you have beliefs that guide everything you do. And so cognitive behavioral therapy recognizes these beliefs shape you, and they can also distort you. Also, cognitive behavioral therapy understands that these beliefs can distort reality in ways that breed self-created and self-inflicted problems for ourselves and others. In other words, if you have a belief that actually may be toxic or problematic, it can distort your reality. For example, if you have a basic belief that all people stink, what's that going to do? You're going to treat people that way. You're going to be self-defensive because you're going to think, I'm the only one who doesn't stink. Everybody else is a problem. And so that, just by virtue of that, that begins to distort the way you are in ministry. Or if you have a belief that I am a victim and everybody is down on me, if I have a belief that I am a victim and everybody is down on me, then what's going to happen is you're going to treat yourself as a victim and actually create situations where you actually may become victimized. You develop patterns based on these beliefs. Also, CBT recognizes that these beliefs can become fixed in ways that distort our perceptions and our emotions and our behaviors, and that can lead to painful consequences. And again, this is huge in leadership because when we have fixed beliefs, for example, the one I kind of pushed on in the beginning, I guess the honeymoon is over. So if you're saying the honeymoon is over, what now belief are you working out of? Anybody want to give a thought, or maybe one that you have worked out of before, but you don't have to say that? What? Now the struggle begins. So now you're seeing everything as a struggle. Even if it's not, you're beginning to interpret everything as a struggle. This is why we're going to have Rachel talk at the end, because she's going to help you come up with different ways of thinking about things.
Parse the difference between a belief and a fixed belief?
Yeah, well, sort of. I'm going to get into it later. Any belief that becomes kind of concrete and now spreads into everything, and no matter what anybody says to you, Peter, it's... So I'm going to try to train myself to repeat the question. What's the difference between, because I realize we're recording, what's the difference between a fixed belief and a belief? A strongly held belief over time, the more you act out of it, the more it becomes fixed, and the harder it is to change. This is why cognitive behavioral therapy can actually be quite difficult, because it can become difficult to actually, once they become concrete, to actually change. And the therapist has to work very gently and persistently to try to open up to other beliefs, to other ideas. And I think, all of us have seen this where people just get fixed beliefs about things and you can't shake them. It's kind of like an Archie Bunker syndrome or something like that. It doesn't matter what you say. It's why Thanksgiving sort of easily falls apart, is because you get the collection of people with fixed beliefs about the way the world is. Is that helpful? Okay. Cognitive behavioral therapy also explores how these beliefs turn into self-destructive narratives that we tell ourselves. And that, again, is part of the difficulty. And especially in leadership, our narratives about ourselves can eventually become self-destructive. What cognitive behavioral therapy tries to do is to change these self-narratives so that we can think about life differently. So we can change how we feel about others, ourselves, and the world, and so we can act in healthier ways. So there's your real summary of, if you ever want to know what a cognitive behavioral therapist does with a client, it's all of these. They explore people's beliefs. They take a look and kind of explore, well, are your beliefs distorting reality? It recognizes that these beliefs become fixed and can be self-destructive, and then it slowly works on changing them. I know you guys aren't going to want to do this, but we have folders for you up here in the front, and you just got to come forward. Yeah, good. So, how did cognitive therapy develop? And why has it become the dominant form of therapy? So, cognitive behavioral therapy, the history of it is it's really an amalgamation of a number of different kinds of therapy that developed over time. But the main two therapists who really developed the underpinnings of cognitive behavioral therapists were Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. Albert Ellis was a therapist. Obviously, that's a picture of him. He was a therapist who, through the 60s and 70s, he had been trained as psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapist, and you don't need to know what those terms necessarily mean. And he began to recognize there's something wrong with the way we do therapy. People come to therapy for years and years and years, and they don't change. And so he began to explore this, and over time realized that the problem is that we react emotionally, not rationally, to the events of our lives. By the way, this is a huge insight. And it's one, by the way, I would encourage you to think about a lot. Because one of the things I have come to realize over time throughout my whole life is we are mostly emotional beings who have periodic periods of rational lucidity. The problem is our emotions fool us into thinking we are rational all the time. Have you ever been in an argument where you cannot change the other person's mind and you both get angrier? It's because once you start moving into that zone, you are no longer talking about rational thought. You are talking emotionally. You now don't want to be wrong.
That's right.
And you don't want them to be right. That's right. And so and he recognized that. And so what he recognized is if you really want to evoke change in people, start by identifying their emotions. Well, what are you feeling right now? And then moving on to, well, how does this influence your thinking? And what are the beliefs that are now coming up out of your emotions that you are holding on to, these beliefs that are becoming your perceptions? And then he said, we need to actually challenge these beliefs that come out of the emotions, because when we change our thinking, we can change our feeling. Thank you. And we can replace them with chosen beliefs that lead to different emotions. Changing what we believe about events changes our emotions and our behaviors. I will tell you, Albert Ellis, a huge influence on me. Back in 1982, I got to see Albert Ellis live when I was working in a psychiatric hospital in Roanoke, Virginia. He was giving a talk at my old college, Roanoke College, a good Lutheran college. He was giving a talk. I will say very rarely have I gone to talks that have changed the course of my thinking in my life. But listening to him talk about rational emotive therapy, the thing that really hit me was he took volunteers from the crowd and asked them to come up, and he would do 10 minutes of therapy with them. And he did it with 3 of them. And it was amazing to watch, because I chose this picture because that's exactly how he sat the whole time. He sat in a chair with his hand like this. And what happened was the people would say, well, I'm having a struggle with XYZ. Don't remember what the struggles were. And so he would listen to them, very patiently. And then he would go, well, tell me what you're feeling about that. And they would talk about the feeling. Actually, no, he would say, what do you think the problem is? And one of them might say, well, the problem is my husband, or the problem is my wife, or the problem is, blah, 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 blah. And he would say, okay, well, that's what you're saying the problem is, but so what you're saying is that's what you feel the problem is. No, that's the problem. Right, but that's what you feel the problem is emotionally. And then he began to work with them, and it was really amazing because all 3 of them walked off the stage smiling, going, oh my God, this is exactly it. This is exactly what I've been struggling with. He really was the one who understood that connection between emotions and thinking and behavior. That a lot of our behavior really is grounded in our emotions. It is not grounded in our rational thinking. But our emotions are really good at fooling our thinking into thinking it's thinking. If that makes sense. The other person who rational emotive therapy is based on is a man named Aaron Beck. What's that? Yeah. Aaron Beck was wonderful. He was very different from Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis was like, I'm going for the jugular. Aaron Beck is, he's wearing a bow tie. This is like kindly man. But he began to question whether exploring the roots of problem can actually make people better. For generations, psychology was grounded in, well, what went on with your parents? What was your childhood like? And by the way, that's still valuable stuff. Nobody says that's not. But what they found is going to the root of problems, people can fully understand why I am the way I am, and then still persist in being the way they are. Just understanding the roots of your problem doesn't change the issue. And so he realized that people who struggle mentally and emotionally have 3 different kinds of thoughts. They have negative thoughts and beliefs about themselves. This is a persistent issue with people in general. I will tell you right now, it's a persistent issue in our country. Culturally, we see everything negatively. That's now our cultural conversation, of which Aaron Beck might say that's the problem. That also recognize that negative thoughts and beliefs about others and the world actually create, that we also have negative thoughts and beliefs about others in the world, and that can actually persist in us. I think a big problem among a lot of people, but among a lot of pastors, is we've become cynical. When we say the honeymoon's over, what kind of thought is that coming from? When we say, why did they lie to me? By the way, I will say this, if you're part of a tradition that has search committees and you do interviews, churches don't lie to you. They put their best people forward on their search committee, and they are the people that are hoping for the future. They put people who can be forward-thinking, future-thinking, for the most part, on their committees, but you're still stuck with a board that may not agree. Nobody's lied to you. By the way, that's a cognitive behavioral approach. That's just reality. The reality is they put their best foot forward to get a good pastor, but their board is constructed in a completely different way, and they may have more negative thoughts. They may be more resistant. And so the reality is when you come there, you've been expressed what the hope is, but the reality may be telling you, I've got to slow down my leadership, I've got to take a different tack, whatever it is. I mean, this is the stuff that I work with pastors on. Go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I think they also have not counted the cost of what it would actually take to get there.
They haven't counted the cost of what, the reality was I was at Calvin Church for 22 years. It wasn't until I was there for 5 years that I felt like everybody got what I was talking about. And it wasn't until 7 years that I felt like it was part of the culture. Because, it had been in decline for 25 years before I got there. And so, they weren't negative, they weren't bad, they were great people. They just, Lyle Schaller said this back in the 80s. He was a Lutheran church researcher who said, if you want a church to grow, it's better to just start your own church. Because he said, if you're trying to turn around a church, he said, you have to do an awful lot of work to actually turn it around. You have to do a lot of basic work just to get the decline to stop, let alone. And so, the reality is when you push a lot of change, people resist because they're acting out of their what? And their emotions. Fear is a huge part of it. Also, final thing, Aaron Beck saw that people struggle with negative thoughts and beliefs about the future. They become hopeless. And this happens to a lot of us, where we get into situations where we begin to start looking at the future and start thinking it's bleak, when it's not. But remember what I said, we begin to get those beliefs that turn into narratives which can become fixed, and then they shape everything. Go ahead, Don.
It seems like the past would be a natural one there. Would that be as part of number one then?
Say that again?
The past.
Yes.
Negative thoughts about the past, would that be more enveloped in number one, thoughts and beliefs about ourselves?
It can be. So the question is thoughts about the future rooted in the past, negative thoughts in the past, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it would
Yeah.
seem like if the future is one of them, getting stuck in negative thoughts about
Yeah.
the past would be a fourth one, but is it more?
I wrote these as 1, 2, 3, but you could turn them into a cycle where really, you begin to spin down kind of a negative. Well, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're spinning down this way. If you're in Australia, you're spinning down that way. Any other thoughts or questions about that? Go ahead, Peter.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Is this about emotions or about negative?
We're going to get into that, all of that. Yeah, that's what the whole morning's about.
Okay.
Yeah, and so what'll happen is when you leave, your head will be spinning, and that's why we've given you, the slides and resources to work with. Yeah, go ahead.
On another that someone just made, when that number one, when you talk about negative thoughts and beliefs about themselves, I kind of agree with you about that number one, because it starts with you.
Yeah, they don't discount the past. What their comment is digging into the past, it makes sense to dig into the past. How did you develop these negative thoughts? But you still need to move towards the future.
I'm not, and I don't know if that's what he was trying to say, but it says negative thoughts and beliefs about themselves. So
Yes.
even the counselor about self-reflection. So, like, when I kind of, if I'm coming from the right direction, where it says with number one, it starts with you.
Do you mean as a leader or as the client? So I would say Most therapists have been trained in CBT and have done their work on themselves. So we use terms transference and countertransference. Transference is being aware of how I am now imposing my own set of struggles onto this relationship with the client. And so, for example, when we do case studies, you know, when therapists, for us, are struggling with a case, they'll bring it before the other therapist to talk about how, you know, what am I not seeing? Or when they do supervision, the supervisor might say, it seems like there's some transference going on. Is there something here that's impacting you? Same is true for us as leaders. You know, we can often have negative thoughts that go into our leadership. And I think what I see a lot in ministry is there are a lot of pastors who may come in with negative thoughts, like all people are bad and sinful and irredeemable and awful. But they also may, through their experiences, because they have something traumatic happen, develop negative thoughts. Plumbing the depths of what those negative thoughts is helpful, but you can't just stay there. The question becomes, how do I change that? So, real quick, there are two other forms of therapy that have really developed out of this. One is called dialectical behavioral therapy, which is often used with people with personality disorders, especially people with borderline personality disorders, where they learn how there's a recognition that they're really immersed in their emotions and everything is assessed through an emotional perspective. And so the counselor works with them on how do you tolerate stress? Instead of reacting to your stress immediately, how do you tolerate it? How do you self-soothe? How do you diminish the stress you feel? How do you gain clarity over your confusion? How do you deal with your frustration? And how do you begin to think more thoughtfully and realistically? This is a very intense form of therapy for people who go through it, and it's very difficult because people who've spent their whole lives reacting impulsively to everybody else around them, it's very difficult for them to tolerate stress because their attacking other people has been their way of dealing with their own stress. In a sense, they outsource their stress to other people. And what you do as a counselor is work with them on how do I change the way I look at things. The other is acceptance and commitment therapy, often called ACT, which is accepting issues and reality as it is and responding in ways that fit the values and morals we want to live in life. And it's also tolerating negative thoughts. Sometimes you can't get rid of negative thoughts, but you don't have to be controlled by them. And so it's learning how to tolerate it and how to respond in a healthy way. Even though my own thinking is going in this direction, I'm not going to act that way. This is really helpful in marriages. You may have a negative thought towards your spouse. Don't act on it. Just let it go. So that's really just a little bit of a background of how it got here. I'm going to start digging into what cognitive behavioral therapy is. If you really want to understand the roots of cognitive behavioral therapy, you have to understand the human brain. Basically, there are two parts, and I'm going to add a third. But the two parts, there is the prefrontal cortex. That's this part. This is where your rational thinking is. What's the last part of the brain that develops over the course of life? Your prefrontal cortex. Why are teenagers so exasperating? Actually, yeah, so what the reason is teenagers are developing their prefrontal cortex, and sometimes they act out of it, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they just act out. And you know, it's like, it's the great example is the kid is having an argument with mom and dad. It's like, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. And then they storm up, and a half an hour later come down and go, so is there any ice cream left in the freezer? And you're like obsessing, like, I'm the worst parent in the world, my child hates me. And this kid has moved on because the kid was not being, in that argument, was not rooted in this developing prefrontal cortex, but was immersed in their limbic system. There's a lot more to the limbic system than these two, but these are the two most important parts. The amygdala, which is your emotional center, which is that little bean right there, and your hippocampus, which is this thing right here, which begins to ensconce your emotions into memories. We are limbic people. Whether we like it or not, we are limbic people. I'll just say that 50 more times. You may think you're rational. You may say you're rational, but even thinking you're rational and saying you're rational is rooted in your limbic system, which wants to get you thinking that you're rational. The limbic system is huge. Why do people spend hours on TikTok? Playing video games, drinking, smoking, porn. Any of these things they're doing is because all of them are either substances or processes that the limbic system, that goes into a loop in your limbic system, and your limbic system wants to keep doing it. I remember when I was growing up, everybody smoked. I was just telling my wife, we're flying to Europe, and we got seats in our plane that are sort of towards the back, and I said to her, yeah, when I was a kid and I was flying, my parents were divorced when I was 2, so I would fly back and forth between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and my mother would often choose the cheap seats, which were back in the smoking section. For those of you who don't know this, back before the, early 80s, late 70s, there was a whole back of the train where everybody just smoked. And we complained about it to my mother, and, when we were like 6, 7, 8, and my mother finally, to help us, put us one row in front of the smoking section. But I remember, people would talk about smoking, and they would say, I can smoke anytime I want to. I just don't want to. Well, no, that's your limbic system talking, masquerading as the prefrontal cortex. This is really important, and it's important to recognize as leaders. When you get that reaction from churches, from church members, they're not necessarily reacting out of rationality, even if they are respectable people, even if they are really successful in their careers. When they are pushing back against you for something that you're proposing or doing, they're not bad, they're not stupid, they're just acting out of their limbic system, but physically it doesn't look like it. This is, to me, is huge in leadership, because if you recognize resistance is not from ignorance, but resistance is a signal to you to slow down or to change tactics, because they're afraid, but they don't tell you they're afraid. They just react from their amygdala, and they talk about it in very rational ways. I think this is, quite frankly, personally, I think this has gone into all of our church denominational splits. These were always emotional conversations, but we all developed theologies around them with lots of proof texting around them to prove why we're right and others are wrong. It doesn't mean I don't necessarily know what the right answer is, but I do know that in my experience in ministry, most of those Presbyterian meetings I went to where people were upset, they were not coming out of their rational theological thinking, despite them thinking they were coming out of their rational theological thinking. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I just want to be clear. You said something like, under the hippocampus, you said something like changes in emotions, change in memories.
The amygdala is responsible for, is really the emotional center. I mean, all of it comes together. The hippocampus is what stores our memories. So memories of emotions. Does that make sense? I will say this is not part of the conversation for today. I also believe that we have a transcendent mind too. This is for another workshop, but I think there's a level to which we also have a transcendent mind that is connected to the holy, to the divine, to God, to the sacred. And actually, if you want to understand discernment, one of the reasons they talk to you about moving into silence and sitting and quiet is to calm down this. Sometimes also to calm down this, so that you can be open to something. And I also believe that when God really is speaking to us, often it is speaking to us through transcendence, but also through our emotions and our thinking at the same time. When you've really heard that, this is what God's calling me to, it's because somehow you've tapped into the transcendent that has also allowed your brain to be ordered in a way that the transcendent speaks through your thinking and through your emotions, and there's a sense of oneness with all of it. But that's for another workshop also. So I want to talk about the thought, emotion, behavior pattern, but are there any thoughts or questions or anything before I move on with that? Good. I hope that means that you're getting what I'm talking about. The problem is I've been trained in this and been doing this stuff for like 40 years. So sometimes it's easy for me to assume everybody knows what I'm talking about, but I don't, because it's not simple to you all when it is to me. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a question for now, but regarding, I mean, this seems so familiar with the limbic system and dealing with our own rationality or somebody else's. What I find is, in congregational ministry, often people sort of get hooked on it.
Yeah.
They get hooked on this feeling of either the anger or the dissent or whatever it is. We were just discussing this, that people become attached to that reaction of the limbic system. So it no longer even becomes a rational thing that they're thinking. That's really hard to engage.
It is. So the question is, like, is there a point where people get so attached to what's going on limbically that it's hard to engage? And the answer is yes. And then this becomes a leadership issue. Because if you can become aware of that, then you recognize, I need to change how I'm behaving towards them, how I'm leading them to actually help them with their fear. One of the things that I learned, so very early on, and this is also the other field I didn't talk about that's gone into cognitive behavioral therapy is what's called behavior modification. And when I worked in a psych hospital with adolescents and children, we ran a behavior modification program where we would set goals on what the kids needed to work towards. And they would receive rewards. Usually it was a stamp in a card they carried that would give them privileges, that would give them, certain things. And if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, they could actually get a punishment, which is a stamp in a different area, which says that they're now restricted. And we had 4 levels. And level 1 was most of the, most of the privileges and everything else. Level 4, you're really restricted. You couldn't go home on the weekends. You were confined to your room for the most part, things like that. In behavior modification, they used to always say, behavior modification always works. If you're trying to go from here to here and it's not working, there are several reasons why. One is the reward is not rewarding. So in other words, if you want someone to be nicer, your spouse to be nicer to you by giving them M&Ms, that's probably not a reward that's going to work. Nor will punishing them by taking away the M&Ms. It's not effective. So one is the reward or the punishment is engaging. Another is you're asking for too big a change. And so you need to step it down to be more sequential. I did this a lot when I was at Calvin Church, where, one of the ways I started writing books and things like that was I often said, the church doesn't want me to inflict my full self on them because I have ideas always. And this has been true here at Samaritan too. Is like, I have lots of ideas, but it's always about what are the steps towards them. If you're getting a lot of resistance, it may mean I need to step it back and do smaller steps towards that, which you actually have. But it's smaller steps towards it. But a lot of times what happens is our limbic system comes in and goes, they don't want to do this. They're against it. Why did I ever think they would want to do it? And instead of going, maybe I'm asking them to take too big a leap, maybe I need to step it down. We did that with our music program, where we just slowly transformed our music program over the course of 15 years. From something that was more traditional with periodic flares of something that was more creative to something that became more creative with periodic flares of traditional. But it took us a long time to do it, and we were really careful about doing it. I have a little mnemonic device, which I say, if you're going to make a change, make it small and in the fall. If waiting till fall is a bummer, do it in the summer. If waiting for summer is agony, do it after Epiphany, because you're coming during times where people are already changing and they're more open to differences. If you try to do stuff in the middle of February or March, and make significant changes, you're more likely to get heavy resistance. As opposed to in the fall, like right after Labor Day, everything looks different. People come in and complain and say, we've been doing this all summer. or it's just, but also they're more adaptable because their kids are all back and going back to school. Their life is crazy, so it's like, this is one more thing. Does that all make sense? Any other thoughts before I move on?
You gave us two problems with behavior modification.
Yeah, I'd have to now remember them. Well, one is the reward. Well, I combined two of them. One is the reward's not rewarding. The second is the punishment isn't punishing. The third is you're moving too fast. The fourth is lacking clarity in what you're trying to accomplish. Like if you said to a kid, your behavior needs to improve, that's your goal. That's not concrete. That's no good. You need to talk about it in a behavioral way. You go over in their contract with them of what is good behavior. Good behavior is picking something up for somebody, holding a door open for somebody, saying something nice to somebody. And if we as a therapist observe them doing that, we would give them a reward for it. If we saw them doing something, like pulling a chair out from under somebody, not only would you get a punishment, but you might be dropped down a level. And so but you need to have clarity about what you're trying to do. A lot of times pastors get caught up in this where we're trying to do stuff, but we're not clear about what we're trying to do. And even if we are, we don't stick to that. Is that helpful? As I said, I've been doing this for a long time, so sometimes those details, yeah, go ahead.
And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later too, but there are also strategies that you can use to shift the energy in the room. So if you're in that, combative conversation, there are things that you can do as a leader in the way you're approaching it that by default of the way you're asking it or explaining it or whatever the strategy is, there's different ones, it works as like a contagion effect. So even if they're not aware of even what you're doing, it de-escalates them just by the way you're doing it. So, and that kind of thing.
Changing the way you are with them changes the way they are with you.
It's a mirror thing.
Yeah. So here's the basic pattern that happens, that this is the pattern that happens in all situations that a cognitive behavioral therapist understands. Number one, our lives are filled with triggers. Triggers are anything that evokes an emotional reaction. It can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. Triggers, and I'm going to be talking about this from the pastoral perspective right now, but this is the basic pattern that's still there. Whenever there is a trigger that happens, and don't pick a big bad trigger, but can you think of a mild trigger that creates kind of maybe a negative reaction that happens in a church to pastors?
Oh, that.
What's that?
We've always done it this way.
Okay, that's a bigger thing. I'm actually thinking smaller. I'll give you one. Somebody comes out in the line and says to you, I don't know why you would have preached that sermon. That's a trigger, right? I mean, it is. Yeah. I had that once where a woman came out and said, I don't know why you would have preached that sermon during communion. I was like, and like everything, have you seen the movie The Terminator? Where, he's got that thing where behind his eye, he's got a whole bunch of options going on. That happened to me. It's like, what do I say? And I didn't say what the Terminator said. But I had a lot of options, and and I don't even remember what I said because I often respond with humor, where I will just say, yeah, I wonder why I preached that sermon also, just as a way of kind of moving the person on. Our lives are full of triggers, especially as leaders. In most of life, our lives are full of triggers, but the issue is we have lots of other people to talk to about it. We have friends that we can unload on. We have spouses. We have other people we can talk to. Often when we're in pastoral leadership, these triggers happen and we don't know who to talk to about them. When a trigger hits us, what happens is they hit our emotions, but they also hit our thinking at the same time. My first emotion is what? If somebody says, I can't believe you preached that sermon on communion, what might my first emotional reaction be? Yeah, well, that's a response.
I mean, but it's
Oh, yeah, excuse me, how dare you? Yeah. So it's more, so now it's more of a defensive aggressiveness. What else might it be? What? I'm hurt? It can escalate to everybody hated my sermon. One person said that to you, and now everybody hated it. That's a thought distortion, by the way. We'll get into that later. It can be, oh my God, I wonder how many other people feel this way. Or it can be, I hate that woman. By the way, the one who said it to me was a woman. I don't hate her. I actually liked her, and she also had growing dementia, so that was part, but I did have to, what happened was, my first emotion was to be defensive and like, I don't know what to say. And then I had to start thinking, and the thoughts, there were a lot of thoughts that raced through my head. And what happens is, as these thoughts race through your heads, they also impact your emotions. So there becomes a thought-emotion cycle. And for me, it was kind of intuitively, what are you feeling right now, and how do you respond not in that way? Do not respond out of your emotions. Respond out of something more gracious. That comes out of my own core beliefs, which we'll get to later, but I've developed, and I think being a therapist and a lot of the rest is when I get criticized is how do I respond in a way that's gracious as opposed to angry, because angry doesn't help. What happens is our emotions feed our thinking, and our thinking feed our emotions. And as we go through that, that eventually ends up sparking a particular behavior, whatever that behavior is. The behavior can be, you're an idiot. The behavior can be going back to your office and sulking for 45 minutes. The behavior can be aggressive. Whatever the behavior is, typically when this happens, you engage in a particular behavior. And that behavior will have consequences. Whatever our behavior is, it always has consequences. The consequences can be good. If you act in a gracious way, the consequences can be good. If you act in an angry way, it can be bad. If you act in a neutral way, there may be nothing that really goes. But they have consequences. This, by the way, goes into our leadership style. When there's conflict, for example, on a board, Joe, who's the head of the building committee, ends up getting angry yet again, my emotions might be fear. My thought may be, how do I protect myself? It feeds into my emotion of, whatever I do, he's just going to dominate even more. And so it may lead to a behavior where I push my chair back and I just let Joe have what it is. The consequences are that Joe begins to dominate everything in the church. Or vice versa. If I yell at Joe and start screaming at him in the meeting, the consequences end up, everybody feels like they either have to back Joe or they have to back me. These triggers, this pattern goes on, whether we recognize them or not, they go on. What's really helpful, if you understand a cognitive behavioral approach, is being able to break it down in the moment, or more likely, break it down afterwards, where you begin to think about it and start asking the question, when I have this emotion in that meeting, can I think differently about it? This is Joe just venting. I need to let Joe vent, and then I'm going to ask everybody else what they think. That's not acting defensively. And because of that behavior, it opens up the discussion, and the consequences are now everybody's working together. If you do the same pattern behavior long enough, it becomes a habit. And what happens is you begin to develop more and more automatic responses to these triggers, and they begin to spread. Thoughts or questions about this so far? Now, it's easy to break this down on a chart. When you're in the midst of it, it's not easy to break it down. Ultimately, what this whole workshop is, I'm trying to give you the tools to develop this on your own, or in conversations with a therapist or a coach or someone else. But being aware of the fact that whenever you are in a situation, this is one of the things I have learned over time. Whenever I'm in a situation where I don't know what to do, one of my first questions is, what are you feeling right now? What am I feeling? And what does it, and this, the more you do it, the quicker this process goes. What am I feeling? I'm feeling defensive. Don't act out of defensiveness. What are alternative ways to act? What happens is over time, too, if you have positive ways of acting that are proved effective and you get good consequences, that becomes a habit also. Where now what happens is I begin to move into a cycle of habits. I begin to move into a cycle of habits that actually are self-propelling and become helpful in everything I'm doing. Does that make sense? We're going to go for about another 10 minutes and then take a break. Basically, the key to cognitive behavioral therapy and a cognitive behavioral approach is that we live in a world full of triggers. And those triggers hit our emotions, our thoughts, and propel behaviors. And there's always this cycle going on all the time. And that always impacts us. Always impacts us. Being self-aware of it changes your leadership. It can help make it more positive. Go ahead, yeah.
This is absolutely wonderful because what happens is we lead by example.
We end up leading by example.
When we get into this,
Yeah.
then people around us and that we're leading, they'll watch that.
Yes.
They'll mimic that behavior.
Yeah. And what that does is that creates a culture where they're now reacting in a more positive way. I mean, a lot of the work I do with pastors, and they don't necessarily know I'm doing this, although those of you who are here who have worked with me now, you know, that often what I will do is I will try to softly challenge the perception. If you push back too hard, I won't. I'll just stop and, we'll move on to other things. But often what I do is, okay, well, what are you feeling about this? What's your thoughts? What behavior? Is that behavior effective? Is what you're doing effective in doing it? And, quite frankly, I will say, I know enough the people here, some of you are really exceptional at actually doing really great things. I mean, a lot of you here are really exceptional at doing great things. And intuitively understand this. The key is being able to understand it in a way that gives you the freedom to act in new ways. Other thoughts or comments? Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
What's the cultural relevance? Predominantly black church, predominantly white church, Korean church. Is there any research on that at all?
I don't, well, that's hard to answer because I don't know there's been a whole lot of research into developing cognitive behavioral skills for pastors in churches. I will say I actually, she gave me permission to mention this. I had a 2.5-hour meeting yesterday afternoon with Professor Deborah Moon, who's at Pitt School of Social Work. And she and John Wallace, who is also, he's vice provost at Pitt and also a pastor in Homewood. They did a research, I have no idea why that static's happening. I just think it's where I'm standing, so sorry about that. They both did a research where they taught cognitive behavioral skills to pastors and members of churches, black churches in the Homewood area. And it was really fascinating because of the improvement that it created in the relationships within the church and building together. But, this is, you have to think about this. This is not an area that typically goes on in churches. Sorry to say this, but in the mainline church, we don't typically look outside of the mainline church for guidance on how to deal with things. We tend to teach theology and Bible and preaching and pastoral care. We don't look into organizational development. We don't look to therapy. We don't look to these things. And where we do, often we're doing things that the therapy world has moved on from, not gotten rid of. But for example, in pastoral care, we're taught Rogerian therapy. You really can't find a Rogerian therapist anymore. It doesn't mean it's invalid. It's just, there's a limited effectiveness to it. That a lot of, early work on using Bowenian therapy by Edwin Friedman in systems theory. Family therapy, they don't ignore Murray Bowen's work, but they've moved on to other modes of family therapy where they're bringing a lot of stuff in, and we just don't do that. So my answer is the research, at least in Homewood, and Debbie and I were talking about the possibilities, so you and I are probably going to have a conversation later about this, about them expanding that research into other churches that are urban, suburban, rural, and teaching these kinds of skills into churches around that. But I think that research is just beginning on that. I don't know if that helps. Does that answer? Yeah, way more than you asked, so yeah. But that's typical. Anything else about this? Yeah.
Sort of a clarification. You were mentioning that if we deal with our thoughts and we maybe behave a different way, like that other people will mimic that behavior or change.
They'll change their behavior. This is something, so the question is, if we change our behavior to these things, will they change theirs?
Yeah.
Not always in predictable ways, and that's why you have to experiment. It's trial and error. But there was a marriage and family therapist named Salvador Minuchin who created a family therapy called structural family therapy, which I was trained in, and I actually used that way more in my ministry than I did a Bowenian grounding. Again, not critical of Bowenian, but you can't get to family of origin stuff a lot of times. So anyway, that's an interior thought. What Salvador Minuchin would say is, if you've got problems in a family, if you change the structure, if dad behaves differently, everybody else is going to have to adapt. If mom and dad, change where they argue, or if you change anything that's different in the structure, the rest of the system begins to also adapt. You changing your behavior as the leader and your perceptions changes, people will adapt in either positive or negative ways. That's why trial and error, sometimes you try it. And by the way, a cognitive behavioral approach is, I tried it, it didn't work. That doesn't mean everything stinks and this is a failure. It just means I tried it and it didn't work. So now this gives me information on how to maybe do it better. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So a few more things and then we'll take about a 5 or 10 minute break. These last two. So how do cognitive behavioral processes impact leadership? Number one, our thinking about issues can be unwittingly influenced or overwhelmed by our feelings and impulses, which causes us to lead impulsively and emotionally without realizing it. If you say to yourself right now, well, I never lead impulsively or emotionally, you actually need to take a look at yourself a little bit. The question, thinking we're being rational and wise all the time, that can be a smokescreen. Nobody's rational and wise all the time. You develop patterns that help you act out of that way. You can develop your own prayer practices, reading practices, all that to help nurture wisdom and acting in different ways, but it's something you have to work on. We don't like the pain of reality, so often we adopt beliefs and behaviors that relieve our feelings, which interferes with good decision making. A lot of times when what we do doesn't work, it's not because it's a failure, it's because we did this to try to relieve our own pain. Be aware of that. If I am angrily defending myself against somebody, I'm not doing it because it's rational. I'm not doing it because it's going to work. I'm doing it because I'm hoping by dominating the other person, I can relieve this pain I feel from the other person. Past traumatic experiences can provoke us to think and act self-protectively, which can disrupt relationships and communities. That's why, for example, if you've had a past traumatic experience, it is important to see a therapist to work through it. Because past trauma, PTSD, can really impact leadership in churches, and a lot of people who go into ministry have had past traumas. Why? Because often what happens is I've had this trauma and I want to make a difference in other people's lives so they won't have this same trauma. It's for good reasons. Sometimes you get someone who has a past trauma and I go into ministry so I can dominate everybody else, control everybody else, and make myself feel better. I don't find that happens a lot, especially in the mainline church. My experience of most pastors is we've had something in our past, we are incredibly sensitive to it, and as a result, I want to help other people. That, by the way, is true of almost all therapists. It's very difficult to find a really good therapist who doesn't have some kind of difficult trauma in their past, but they've worked through it. And they're now devoting their lives to helping others. Same thing with the recovering alcoholic who becomes a sponsor or a therapist. We become so accustomed to articulating emotionally determined perspectives in rational sounding ways that we believe everyone else is irrational, not us, creating confusion and conflict. I will tell you on a personal level, as a Presbyterian pastor, this last one hits me a lot because I have a suspicion, and this is going to make me a heretic. I have a suspicion a lot of our theology is emotionally based. It's not necessarily rooted in the experience of God. You know, one of the biggest emotional, cultural things we have is tribalism. What'd you say? Yeah, they are. But I'm 66 and close enough to retirement that, you know. But I look at it and I think about, you know, all of our theologies. A lot of it is rooted in tribalism. I'm part of the Reformed tradition. How many of you are part of the Reformed tradition? How many of you aren't? How many of you aren't? Yeah, see, that's your problem? Yeah, right there, right there. You guys are Lutherans. You are following the wrong, well, that's an emotional response. You know, it's like you're wrong because you're just wrong because I feel like you're wrong. It reminds me of something the husband of a colleague said. There's a guy who listens to talk radio all the time, and he and his wife were having arguments about things politically, and he said, if you could just feel what I feel, you'd know I'm right. It's like, but that's it. And I think that's a problem sometimes for us considering other points of view because we are tribal, we're trying to protect our tribe, and ideas from the outside can feel threatening. That's a reality. I think it's a reality. You know, one of the big areas I think a lot about, I talk a lot about, is people who say I'm spiritual but not religious. They're saying to us, you're religious but not spiritual. They're telling you what they want. They want something more deeply spiritual, but we are so theologically oriented that a lot in the mainline church feel threatened by spirituality that is not rooted in a particular theological understanding. What happens if somebody has a near-death experience and it doesn't fit our understanding of what happens when we die? What do we do with it? We tell them it didn't happen. That's tribalism, and that's also part of our makeup. Any other thoughts, real quickly? I'm going to do one last slide, and then we'll take a 5-ish minute break. So, phrases that are built, that I have developed for myself, that are built on this cognitive behavioral approach. And I tried to sit down and think of a lot of them, but they usually don't come up until an actual situation. But one is, just because someone says something offensive doesn't mean I have to be offended. Just because you say something offensive to me doesn't mean I have to let you control my emotions by saying that. And that's something that has followed me from early ministry on through. Because you all know people say offensive things to you. But that doesn't mean I have to be offended. You don't control me. I can think graciously. I can respond in a way that's caring and compassionate, that's more rooted in my core beliefs and my values. Another is, nobody makes us angry. We choose to be angry. This is straight from, what's his name, from Rational Emotive Therapy. He used to say that when somebody would say, you made me so angry. No, nobody makes you angry. Nobody holds you down and says you have to be angry. You choose to be angry. You choose to adopt that emotion in the face of everything else.
That's an effective response when somebody says that to you too, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I choose to be angry. Yeah, you're choosing to be angry, yeah. Yeah, remember that our behaviors have consequences. Just because it feels like someone is trying to sabotage us doesn't mean they're actually sabotaging us. Most people who we see as saboteurs to what we're doing do not see themselves as saboteurs. They see themselves as trying to protect something. As soon as we think of them as saboteurs, we are now moving into that emotional thinking cycle where we now respond to them as though they're saboteurs. If you respond to somebody who's deeply resistant and it feels like they're sabotaging by sitting down and talking with them and trying to get their perspective on things, what you'll find is they're in fear. They're trying to protect something that they wanted. There may not even be against what you're doing. They just don't understand what you're doing. and it feels like a threat. Another is, I may feel like nobody cares, but that doesn't mean nobody cares. A lot of times in ministry, we get caught up in thinking nobody cares about what I'm going through, and then we move, and this is a problem because it can include our families. We're used to having people in our family be the people we talk to, and there's a certain point, if you're married long enough, they're just going, yeah. So anyway, where do you want to go to dinner on Friday? Feeling like nobody cares does not mean that's reality. Can you think of any other little phrases maybe that you all use that kind of corresponds to this? Start developing them. I actually have a million of them. I actually wrote a book back in 2017 called Ministry Proverbs. It got written, I think, in the wrong publisher because it was a publisher that was starting to fail. And so right at the time they published, it was going under. So didn't get much marketing. But a lot of what I did was I just wrote a lot of these little proverbial kind of phrases with some explanation on it. So let's take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back together. Go ahead, Stella. Before I just jump ahead, are there any questions or thoughts? Because I now want to start moving deeper into the insights of cognitive behavioral approach. Yeah, Nancy. The transcendent. About the transcendent? So the question is, I've talked about the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, and I showed something about the transcendent. And this is rooted in my experiences. This isn't just a theological perspective, but it's, what's that? Yeah, we'll follow up maybe next fall on a class of opening up to the transcendent in churches. I believe, and there's a lot of neuroscientists who are now starting to believe this. There's a debate that's going on in the field of neuroscience of the materials point of view, is this all there is? And transforming consciousness point of view, is there a consciousness that's beyond us? My experiences throughout my whole life has been there's a realm of thinking that's beyond us that connects with a lot of other people, connects with a lot of other realms. It's not just in Christian thought, it's in a lot of other religions. Jung talked about it, other people have talked about it. But there's to me, the simple way of saying it is, I can be aware of my emotions, I can be aware of my thinking. There's also a level to which I can be open to what I sense God's calling me to do. And by doing that, I'm also tapping into a wisdom and a way of thinking that's beyond that. Great example of this. In coming to Samaritan, you've heard me say this a number of times, I did not want to leave my church at all. It was actually, I went through a 2-year period of grief after leaving Calvin Church because I wasn't ready to leave it. And I had to really struggle with my emotions, which were all saying, do not go there. But my thinking was kind of on the fence, but there was something transcendent that went on inside me that said, but this is where you're called to go. Since I didn't trust my own emotions and thinking and transcendence, I asked people like Ralph to also pray about this and to say, because Ralph came out of Calvin Church, so he knew my ministry there. He also kind of knew me. And so I asked him and 2 others to pray about it. And basically, when I got together with Ralph, I had already kind of sensed, okay, my thinking is a little bit distorted, but I'm getting this strong sense of I'm called to go to Samaritan. And I talked to him, and he goes, hey, buddy, I know this isn't the answer you want to hear, but you're called to go to Samaritan. And so did the other 2, right? Did I get that right? Yeah. I mean, even the exact language he said. He called me buddy. But I think there is a level that also for those of us who are open to it. I'm actually I'm sort of in psychology mode, so I'm not used to thinking about it spiritually, even though spirituality runs through everything I do. So maybe we will have a follow-up class on that, of just how to open up to the transcendent on that. Anything else? So I want to start moving into deeper stuff about this. we develop our patterns of thinking, feeling, behavior. This sentence doesn't work right, but our patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving are rooted in core beliefs. These are beliefs that lie at the center of us that basically give us our perspective, that shape how we think. They're really rooted in our traditions. You know, whatever traditions we come out of, and it's, you know, it's these traditions are cultural. You know, the cultures we all grow up in. I mean, it can be as simple as, you know, growing up Presbyterian or Episcopalian or Baptist or non-denominational or an historically black church, or it can be Catholic or whatever. These can be cultural beliefs which really are a part of our makeup, because the reality is that growing from childhood on, we are immersed in cultural teachings. You know, they're both intuitive and they are global and they are personal. Our family shapes our patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving. You know, people will go, well, of course I argue all the time. I'm Italian. You know, for my wife, it'll be, well, of course you argue all the time. You're Scottish. You know, and it can also be our temperament. You know, our temperament can go into it. I mean, I have twins, twin girls, born 3 minutes apart. They look exactly like each other. In a lot of ways, they think the same. But what's funny is the first time I held Shay and the first time I held Aaron, they both had different responses. I won't say which one's which, but one of them looked at me like, what are you doing? And the other one was like, what's going on? And you know, those temperaments have kind of stayed. They become part of our family lore. Traumatic or difficult experiences go into our core thinking. You know, we may have been very positive, but if someone has really hurt us, that shapes our core beliefs. People can't be trusted. Or if we grow up in a real trusting situation, people can be trusted. Our social environment, everything around us. By the way, what's going on culturally right now, just in our whole country and the world? That is shaping us, but it's also shaping a lot of younger people. It is shaping people who are moving away from Christianity because they see Christians as being in the forefront of the battle, of the cultural battle. And, you know, David Kinnaman, as part of a book called Unchristian, 20 years ago, researched the attitudes of people 16 through 29 who had walked away from the church. Significant numbers, like 70 to 80% saw Christians as uncaring, as not following the Bible, as being hypocritical, as being anti-homosexual, as being a whole slew. And whether we're that way or not, that's the way a lot of them see us. You know, that they have been shaped by a culture that has seen battles on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and all of that. That is shaping for them. These all go into these patterns that are existing in us. So what I'm going to have you do is we're going to take about, you're not going to really complete this exercise. You can find a white piece of paper. I meant to put a piece of notebook paper in there. You can either write these down or just sit and think, but I do want you to do this. I don't want you to just pull out your phone and do it, because that's just avoidance behavior. Seriously. I want you to take through a process. I want you to think of a difficult recent event where a trigger evoked a strong emotional response. Again, you don't have to share this with anybody else. You can write it down, or you can just do it in your head. What I'm just wanting you to do is to practice this a little bit. I want you to identify what was the trigger. I want you to identify what was the trigger. I want you to name the emotion you felt in response to the trigger. Frustrated, threatened, angry, scared, anxious, something else. Then move to what thoughts developed in response to that action. And then move into what actions did you take in response? What was your behavior? And then what were the consequences of these actions? Positive, negative, meh, helpful, not helpful? Just in your mind, what happened as a result of it? And finally, what might have been an alternative thought or action? By the way, if you don't complete it, it's okay. You have this slide. We're also going to give you an exercise that Rachel has put together that's already in your book your notebook that you can use. But we're going to take 10 minutes to just work through this and try to do it because this is going to open you to how do you understand cognitive behavioral approach. Go ahead, John.
Would you distinguish between 1 and 2? Because it seems like the difficult event.
Yeah, I just want you to think of an event.
I'm sorry.
So I just want you to think of a difficult event.
Okay.
As you think of it, as you get it in your mind, I want you then go, what was the trigger in that event? So let's say it was a difficult session meeting, right? I had a difficult session meeting. Okay, what was the trigger in that meeting that triggered something in you? Just identify it. It could be something someone has said, a word that was said, an attitude somebody had, a face that they had, whatever it is, just be clear about what the trigger was. So ultimately what you're seeing here is, to me, it's really important when you're in situations to break them down. You know, it's funny because it's really only been in the past 2 years that I realized I've been doing this for a long time with myself. But you know, sometimes when you're trained in something in one area, you don't realize how much you're bringing it in to other areas. And I realize that like any kind of difficult situation I'm in, often I will try to talk to someone else about what's going on. But I've trained myself to basically, okay, what's the, you know, I don't usually call it consciously in my mind what's the trigger, but I will identify that person said blah, 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 and I felt this way in response. And my thoughts were this, and this is how I wanted to behave. And you know, sometimes if I go through something that's difficult that didn't work well, I will go back and re-look at it and go, you know, okay, what happened? That person said this, and I immediately felt this, and I thought this, and I did this, and it didn't work. What could I do differently? You know, and I will do this with myself. I think this is hugely important as leaders to do this because really good leaders are always self-assessing. Really good leaders are always self-assessing. Really bad leaders are always other-assessing without self-assessing. Really great leaders are able to self-assess and other-assess in ways that are really grounded in reality, not emotionality. And reality is, what's the real situation? For example, I started out by saying, when you say the honeymoon period is over, that's coming from a core belief that your relationship as a pastor in a church is very similar to a marriage. It's not. You don't get to sleep with your church. And your church doesn't snore. You know, it just you know, the metaphor, what? Maybe, but that metaphor only goes so far. The reality is, the honeymoon isn't over, just what you experienced is a bummer. That's it. But if you have a core belief that this is true, now you are modifying everything you do in response to the honeymoon is over. You're now engaging in negative thinking. You're now getting into a pattern of negative thoughts about them and even about yourself. So, I now want to talk about core beliefs and schemas. This is also a huge part, and it's now taking the cognitive behavioral approach to another level. Any last questions or thoughts before I move on to this? So what is a schema? A schema is a story we tell ourselves based on our core beliefs, and I'll give you a definition of core beliefs in a second. Schemas are stories we tell ourselves based on core beliefs about ourselves, people, things, events, situation, politics, faith, and life, which influence how we interpret and respond to life. Schemas are the stories we tell ourselves about everything. It can be about someone who's close to you. It can be about our kids. I mean, I think this is a problem sometimes with parents, is they will go, well, my child is lazy. Maybe not. It's just maybe that your child's not passionate about the same things you're passionate about. That's not laziness. That's just, I don't want to do what you want me to do. There are other things I really want to do. But once we develop this schema, and it's a story we tell ourselves, my son or my daughter is lazy, that becomes a story that influences everything else. Part of being good in this process is beginning to challenge your own schemas. You can't live without schemas, but you can determine what stories you will change about yourself. I'll give a good example, although it's coming from a different field. In family therapy, does anybody know what the golden ratio is? It came out of the work of a University of Washington psychologist named John Gottman. John Gottman studied, well, initially 25,000 couples. You know who he is. 25,000 couples. Now it's like over 200,000 couples. And he found that marriages that are successful exhibit what's called the golden ratio. In that case, the golden ratio is, relatively speaking, a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions. He says that if you slip, this is how powerful negative interactions can be. If you slip below, where you're having one negative interaction to every 3 or 4 positive ones, your marriage starts to fall apart. And they work on that. It said one of the biggest significant things is, he basically says a marriage is probably struggling and maybe even on the way out if you start seeing the couple roll their eyes to each other. Because they're following a schema. Yeah?
Who defines positive reaction?
Well, he did, because he did the research on it. But positive reaction, but that's a good question. Positive reaction isn't necessarily intimacy. It can be sharing a cartoon with each other. Sharing.
Both have to have that feeling of it being positive.
Both have to be 5-to-1.
Right.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, like something that's positive to me and negative to you is not a positive interaction, but it can be watching a television show together, going out to dinner together, holding hands. It can be more deep intimacy. It can be, just laughing at something. It can be taking a walk together. Negative is just anything that's critical. And often a lot of troubled marriages move into the range of 3-to-1 positive to negative, 2-to-1, or even negative to negative. And that just becomes the pattern. And so what Gottman therapy does is it works on changing that ratio of getting a sense of what's the ratio here and how do we train people to have more positive interactions. Same is true, by the way, in churches. I think there's a golden ratio in churches. The more negative interactions that go on in the church, the more the church starts falling apart. It becomes part of the leader to develop a positive culture, ethos, habitus, whatever fancy word you want to use for it. If you are, not just a pastor, if you're a youth director, or you're a choir director, the more positive you are, the more they're going to work together. And you have to be careful even about the negatives. Are you framing the negative in a positive way or a negative way? And a lot of us slip into that. But it's based on a schema. The negative stuff is the criticism will continue until behavior improves. Or criticism will continue until morale improves. A great example of this, I went to a private school in Philadelphia growing up, Haverford School. Probably shouldn't have said its name, but it doesn't really matter because this is back in the 60s. By the time I got into 4th grade, every teacher had a paddle in their room and used it regularly, unfortunately on me. And it didn't work. It just made me more stubborn. But for them, and also, it's funny because my mother gave me my report cards, 30 years ago, my wife was looking at them on a Saturday morning, and she said, "Graham, what kind of grades did you get when you were in elementary school?" And I said, "Mostly C's and D's." And she said, "You were mostly an A student with a few B's, but you always got a D in deportment." Anybody know what deportment is? I'm ADHD. And basically what happened was that imprinted on me to the point where, because of that criticism that was on every report card and on the green slips that went home, they call them green slips, where they would tell you what your bad behavior was. And there's a part at the bottom where the parent had to fill it out and tear it out. And I had a stockpile of hidden green slips in my room until usually the school would call her and said, "I understand you have some green slips." And I'd go, "Okay." And I'd pull out the sheaf of green slips. But for them, it was, if we paddle you, if we criticize you, you're going to get better. What it did was it imprinted on me, everybody hates me. It just imprinted that on me, which has taken a long time in my adulthood to, only most people hate me, but not everybody. We all have self-schemas which become self-narratives that heavily influence our thoughts, emotions, and behavior. They can be negative. I'm always a victim. I'm helpless. Everyone hates me. I'm a nobody. They can be positive. I'm strong. I'm smart. I'm likable. I'm influential. I'm helpful. That reminds me of the Al Franken things, the Stuart Smalley, where I'm good enough and I'm strong enough. And gosh darn it, people like me, But that is part of the positive psychology of saying self-affirmations. It's to counteract negative schemas. And there's neutral. It can be, I'm here, I'm sometimes good, I'm sometimes bad. But these schemas are, we all have schemas, and the more aware you are of your own schema, the more you can choose a different schema and a different way of behaving. These come from core beliefs. Core beliefs are deeply held beliefs about life, about ourselves, others, the world, or anything that drives how we experience everything. They can come from our culture. They can come from our family. We can create them ourselves out of bad experiences. They can come from our nation. They can come from the world. They can come from our ethnicity. They can come from, our generation. We all develop these core beliefs, and these are the thing at our core that really drive our schemas and that also start to drive our emotions and our thinking. You don't get rid of core beliefs, but you do have a choice on what core beliefs you want to hold. And for a lot of leaders, it's important periodically to ask the question, what is my core belief in life and how do I respond out of it? For example, one of my core beliefs is that we are called to care about everybody, we are called to love everybody. And so I have been, in my whole life, have tried to be disciplined in, even if you respond to me in a negative way, I'm going to try to respond in a caring way. Even if what you said hurts me. It leads to, like little jokes I have is be like, someone will go, you're really a problem, Graham. And I'll kind of go, yeah, not only that, there are even more people who think like you. Where I'll use humor as a way of defanging it, even though it really hurts. I'm not going to attack you the way you're attacking me. But I've chosen, in many ways to take my Christian faith, especially the Sermon on the Mount, and stuff from John 13 through 17 on how am I going to shape my life and live that way. A lot of times we don't reflect on our core beliefs. So as a result, we have core beliefs that may be moving in a direction that's away from how we want to be. And by the way, learning how to respond to your core beliefs takes a lot of trial and error. There is no right way. For me, it's been getting a lot of education. And I don't mean just going to academic school. I mean, it's going to workshops like this. When I was a pastor, even though I wasn't actively a counselor, a lot of the workshops I went were counseling ones. I did one on dealing with emotional manipulators. I did another one with counseling people with personality disorders because I wanted to really still keep thinking through, even as a pastor, how do I respond to people who are problematic? How do I respond in a caring way? The core beliefs become eventually turn into the stories we tell ourselves in response to experiences. The world is bleak and hopeless, offering nothing but sorrow. The people want to sabotage our success. There's great beauty and abundance all around. Many of us have chosen this as our core belief and our core perspective. I think a lot of people who've walked away from Christianity but still see themselves as spiritual but not religious, because I'm in touch with a lot of them because of some other organizations I belong to, they really have adopted this view of there's grace and beauty and abundance all around and we need to look at it. Rachel in her coaching has really pushed this idea of adopting a perspective of abundance rather than scarcity. And I think ironically in our country, we are an incredibly abundant culture and everybody has a core belief of and a schema of scarcity, that someone's going to come and take away everything we have. And sometimes they will. core belief is that we're victims and we're helpless, or that if I work hard enough, I can overcome anything, even if it means sacrificing my health. I see this a lot in ministry where I keep working harder and harder and it's not getting better, and my response is, then stop. But I have to. But no, you don't. That there's nothing, if it's not working, don't do it. That for me, a big part of it has always been, how do I live a balanced life? So to me, it's how do I lead out of balance? Not out of balance, but how do I leave out of a framework of balance? Yes, if we work on it. Yes, our core beliefs can change if we work on them. We all have core beliefs. For the most part, they've been shaped by others. But we can be intentional, and it comes, well, it's not just thinking.
But I mean,
Yeah, to me, it's reading.
identified.
Yeah, it comes through reading, it comes through praying, it comes through talking with people who you admire and you want to learn from them. It's being intentional about what I immerse myself in and surround myself because I want to become like this. It also can mean getting away from those who pull you down, because that happens too. Sometimes the path to health is moving away from people who you like and like you, but have a negative, toxic perspective that is influencing you. The basic issue is that we are all interpretive beings. Whether you know it or not, we interpret everything. We interpret other people's faces. We interpret their behaviors. We interpret their mindsets. This is, again, I talk about marriage. This is one of the problems. Most arguments in marriages aren't over what the person said. It's over what I think the person means. That's really hard because for the most part, the things that turn into explosive and, by the way, my knowing this don't get the impression that somehow I'm immune to this. Both my wife and I interpret each other's facial gestures, behaviors, tones of voice all the time, especially when you're tired. Well, I'm not going to tell you about my marriage. I'm just you all have your own marriages to work on or not, whatever it is. The issue for leadership is our pastoral training is also embedded with core beliefs and related schemas based on interpretations rooted in our theological traditions, our denominational histories, our biblical interpretations. A lot of Christians like to treat their interpretations as fact. This is what the Bible says, especially you, Matt. This is what the Bible says, and you must adhere to it. But really, I'm offering my interpretation of what the Bible says. But we don't like to think they're interpretations. We like to think they're facts. It can...
We use phrases like the plain meaning of the text.
Yeah, the plain meaning of the...
My argument is always, there's no such thing.
Yeah, the plain meaning of the text. I mean, we do it all the time. And we proof text. Because I've lined up 15 passages that agree with me. It's factually true. The Bible is not fact. It is a library of different perspectives. I say this to people. We think of the Bible as a book. But if you go back to the first century, what did the Bible look like? A whole shelf or a room full of scrolls. And you didn't carry it around with you. You went there and you pulled out the scroll, maybe blew dust off of it, and then looked for things. It's also rooted in our institutional traditions and in our personal experiences. This goes into, if we want to potentially change our thoughts and behaviors and patterns and consequences, it's helpful to understand what our schemas are and how they reflect or don't reflect our core beliefs, but it's also helpful to question at times, do I agree with this theological understanding? This has been my struggle. I will tell you, this has been my struggle in my life because I'm a Presbyterian pastor. I'm supposed to choose the Reformed point of view over everything else. I also am a trained therapist through my master's in social work, and that's also a perspective. I also have a PhD in spirituality where I have studied not only Christian spirituality from a Presbyterian tradition, but across the mainline Pentecostal, evangelical, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Sufi Islam, and in dialogue with science and art and literature and everything else. It's really hard for me to just look at that and say one perspective is the only one, despite other people telling me one perspective is the only one. And also my temperament is, if you tell me something's true, my first reaction is, nuh-uh. Really? Okay, I want to go investigate this because I'm not sure that's true. It's being aware, all of this stuff, it can be overwhelming. Graham is telling me now I not only have to figure out what my triggers are, my emotional responses are, my thinking, but I now have to figure out what story I tell myself, and would it make a good Hollywood movie, and what my core beliefs are, but I also now have to look into all my theological traditions, denominational history, biblical interpretation, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying, giving you the tools to just develop self-awareness. That's all. It's just self-awareness. It's, the more you are aware of triggers and responses, the more you become aware of schemas. And the more you become aware of the schemas, the more you're able to look at your core beliefs. And the more you're able to do that, the more you're able to start asking the question, not what do I disagree with, but what do I agree with? What shapes me in a positive way? And what doesn't? And can I let go of that or not? And what are the ramifications of letting go of it or not? So the idea is not to go through a discipline, because disciplined study of everything. Quite frankly, this is why people go to therapists. The therapist helps you to work through these things, and by working through a particular event or incident or situation, they help you do this. They help you dig down and to become more self-aware. There is no level of self-awareness where anybody's perfect in this stuff. But what does happen is as you get used to it, it starts to happen more intuitively, where you begin to recognize, oh, crap, I was acting out of a particular, this is just out of that story I constantly tell myself. And then it helps you think different ways. By the way, this is what the tradition of Christian spirituality and spirituality in general has always been, which is to move into a place of awareness and being where you're more open to God as a relationship, and you're allowing that to actually change the way you think, the way you see, the way you behave, where you're opening up to God or angels or guides or whatever you want to call them to lead me into a different way of being. Thoughts about this? Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I just have a question too about with pastors, is I'm thinking about gossip within the church setting and pastors dealing with that, is through, let's say, institutional traditions or their own personal experience. Because it can be so devastating for pastors and other churches.
It can be.
More devastating when the pastor is the one that's gossiping.
Yeah, that's true. But let me approach this from also a cognitive behavioral perspective. Is it really gossip? That's a perspective. It may be them expressing something that they're struggling with and they don't have an avenue to talk about it or to resolve it. We don't look at it this way because we have, this is one of those ways of looking like the honeymoon period. They're all gossiping. They're all gossiping, that's the problem. Maybe what it is they're not so much gossiping as much as they're struggling in their relationships. So is there a way that I can help form healthier relationships here? And am I part of the problem? This is what cognitive behavioral therapy asks you to do, is to look at things where again, we call it gossip. That's a schema. And it may be. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm also saying take a look at it from the outside. What's underlying the gossip? Is it fear? Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is there any way I can address that? Or, I can attack it in a sermon. Is that the best way to do it? Maybe not. Well, you're all gossiping. You're just a bunch of gossipers. That's probably not going to help you a whole lot. But you experiment. I'm aware that this is an issue. I'm talking to other people about it who can help me gain another perspective, and I'm now looking at different ways of responding to it to maybe shape the culture in a different way. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
I don't think you've used the word yet, but the word empathy keeps popping into my mind.
Yeah.
How close is empathy to this, and where does that fit in? I mean,
Well, I think, part of seeing things with a realistic perspective is also looking at things empathetically. It is understanding the emotions, but it's also looking at it, and, now this may come out of my schema. People who are acting out often are acting out because there's something going on in that is creating toxic behavior. Is there a way to change that behavior? But it does mean I have to now look at them in a different way. I have to look at them in terms of they're not responding this way because they're bad. They're responding this way because they're anxious, they're afraid, they're uncomfortable. One of the things so we made a lot of changes over the course of my life at Calvin Church, and you have too at the House of Prayer. What I found was I over-explained everything that was about to happen. We would start 4 months beforehand telling people, in 4 months we're going to make this change. In 3 months we're going to make this change. 2 months, 1 month, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, blah, blah, blah. And we would explain why. And we would also say, this is just an experiment. We're going to do it for 6 months to see if it works or not. After I'd been there about 15 years, people finally said, came up to me and said, you know what, just make the changes. We trust you. You don't have to explain it. Just let us know how to operate. But that's because over time we built this culture of trust. But for me, it was always, remember what I said about behavior modification? Make things in shorter steps. It's better to over-explain than under-explain because under-explaining creates anxiety. Over-explaining just makes people tired of you. That's been my whole life. Other thoughts? Yeah, Jordan.
I think through some of this stuff too, in terms of complaints. I don't get gossip. I get the complaints.
People complaints.
And one of the things I learned from appreciative inquiry, which is a organization.
And that's also, appreciative inquiry is rooted in cognitive behavioral therapy. But anyway, keep going, Jordan.
One of the things they do is if you get a complaint, they'll reframe it.
Yes.
Say, okay, it sounds like you have an idea of how you want this to go. Tell me what that is.
Yes.
Or don't tell me what's wrong, but what do you want here?
Well, yeah, exactly.
If this was working right, what would it look like?
Yes.
So that's the other thing is instead of getting, because I get caught up in the complaints.
Yes.
Be able to reframe them.
To reframe what's going on in a more positive way. Sometimes it's simply, I want the church to go back to the way it was when I was a kid. And it's kind of like, how to, in a helpful way, say, so do I, but it's not going to happen. The question is, how do we move forward in a way that recreates something of what you remember, that does bring young families back, that does bring that sense of energy that you experienced 50 years ago here? Yeah.
Even asking the question, why do you want it to go back? Because then that can take you to the place of what it is that they're missing and
Yeah.
be able to incorporate it.
Tell me your story.
Right.
Tell me the story of what it was like. I mean, I did that at Calvin Church my first years. I talked to everybody about what their experience of the church was, what their story, so I could really get a sense of emotionally. I mean, you can see a lot of the stuff I did is really bringing therapeutic techniques into leadership. But I think that's what's missing a lot of times in the mainline church is there's this whole body of knowledge out there, this whole body of relational stuff that we are not bringing into the mainline church that could really help us develop better churches. I'm going to say something because I also work with quite a number of non-denominational pastors. They're doing a lot of this. For whatever reason, they feel comfortable bringing in business principles, communication principles, but also counseling principles into the way they do things, and it's leading to growing churches. But, we become a little bit tribal in our silos, and we don't talk to all these other people. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned a couple slides back about negatives and maybe you see something, are you looking at it as a negative light or positive? But what if something is just negative and you don't want to take away that person's experience and put a positive spin on it when they're not in that place and you kind of undermine the way that they're feeling about it?
Yeah, so, and this is more personal. Yeah, this is more personal. Naming what things are is important. Being able to say, we don't work with people who've had trauma and say, it really wasn't trauma. it's just an opportunity for you to grow. Well, that's ridiculous. It was trauma. We help them process the trauma. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with supporting them and saying, what happened to you should not happen to people. What happened to you was wrong. But the cognitive behavioral says, but you can live your life in response to that wrongness and go down a spiral, or you can choose to, as I say, don't let these people live in your head rent-free. Or you can choose a way of living that's not rooted in that trauma. There's two terms. We've all used PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also something called post-traumatic growth syndrome. And they found that there are people who go through trauma and actually grow through it, but their way of reflecting on it is different. But to your point, Lauren, important point, you do not deny what their experience is. What you do work with them on is how do you change your perspective? It's the word Mike used back there, which is how do we reframe this in a way that's going to lead to a healthier way of living? Is that helpful? Okay. So basically, I want to now talk about cognitive distortions. We're going to take a break. I'm going to come back after the break, and I'm going to summarize, and then Rachel's going to take over. I don't know why this isn't working, but it'll come back. So one of the key things for cognitive behavioral therapy is identifying what are called cognitive distortions. These are ways of thinking that are responses to emotions, schemas, and core beliefs that actually become destructive to the way we're thinking. And depending on who you talk to, there are 11 or 13 different cognitive distortions. Doesn't matter because I don't have them memorized anyway. I know them enough to recognize when it's happening, usually 2 sessions after I should have noticed it. But it's still helpful to recognize it because as a leader, there's one of these that I'm going to say, and you're going to go, oh, I wonder if I do this. That's where it's helpful. Because if you're able to recognize the cognitive distortion, you're able to change the cognitive distortion. So basically, a cognitive distortion is a problematic or skewed belief that I hold, interpretation of what's going on, or thought pattern based on emotions rather than fact. That's an important word, fact. A lot of times we engage in situations and we don't stay with the facts of what happened. We go with the interpretation of what happened. Good cognitive behavioral therapists will always get you to talk about the facts, and they'll break it down. Okay, you've told me what you think happened. Let's talk about what happened from a more objective perspective. What do you, and all that. These patterns are based on emotions rather than facts that cause us to inaccurately read or understand a situation, event, or relationship. Cognitive distortions generally lead to self or other or situation damaging ways. So, what are they? You'll recognize these, not only maybe in yourself you'll recognize these, I guarantee you there's 15 people in your lives that you will recognize these thought distortions in all of them. Because we're really much better at doing these things and applying it to other people than we are to ourselves. But that doesn't matter, just getting them anyway. Number one is black and white thinking. I mean, this goes on all the time in life. We come across people who are just black and white thinkers. They see things as either this or it's that. There is no gray in between. It's absolutist, either or thinking, this or that approach to every situation that causes us to misread or create conflict. Black and white thinking is anybody who doesn't go along with what I want is sabotaging what I want. Black and white thinking is anybody who doesn't agree with my theological facts are just wrong. Anybody who doesn't agree with my biblical fact and understanding of this passage is just wrong. But it can also be all men suck. All women are the problem. It can be, the black and white thinking is where we move into a place where we only see this or that, and we don't see the reality of reality, which is reality is fluid. It's not just gray, it's rainbowed. Should I repeat it? What did I say? Yeah, what did I say? The reality of it, you want to stay with the reality of the reality, not your own created reality. Yeah. I did say that. Another one is just overgeneralizing. A belief that something negative is doomed to repeat or always happen. I see this a lot with pastors where we put blanket generalizations on everything. When I said, they don't, when I said before, one of the cognitive distortions was they don't want to go where I'm leading. The cognitive distortion is I'm generalizing maybe what two people who are powerful in my church are trying to do, but not the whole church. But I've now generalized it to the whole church. This is why, to me, it's so important to basically recognize a church is a community, but there is no they in the church. It's not me versus them. It is we are a community of people with different functions and roles, temperaments and perspectives in this community trying to work together. And there are some people who don't like the direction we're going in. But that doesn't mean everyone is. By the way, let's go back to black and white thinking. Sometimes in churches there's a problem, some people in a church may not like the pastor. And what happens is the conflict creates a situation where everybody starts moving into black and white thinking. You're either for the pastor or against the pastor. And that's a situation where the whole community begins to develop a cognitive distortion. And that's a situation where, people like Ralph, who is an associate presbyter for Episcopal Presbytery, or others, Peter, you with the Lutheran Church, you have to go into these churches, and it's trying to get them out of that black and white thinking. No, it's not just the pastor versus everyone else, versus this group versus that group. Maybe we need to work on the leadership in some way, right? But that's problem is they merge black and white thinking with overgeneralization. Another is magical thinking. Everything will magically get better if I just become thinner, richer. If I move to a new church, everything will get better. What you find, though, is when you go in the front door of that new church, all the problems you left in your past church are probably all still there. Sometimes not. Sometimes it's great. But a lot of times when you move to the new church, you find that whatever the difficulty was that you're grappling with may be greeting you at the door. Magical thinking is if I get a new job, everything will improve. If I get a new girlfriend or boyfriend, everything will improve. If I get a new spouse, everything will improve. Elizabeth Taylor did that 8 times. I don't know if she ever got it right or not, but that's because I don't really study the history of Elizabeth Taylor. Another is the fallacy of fairness. If I do everything perfectly, I'll be rewarded. Or everything should work according to what I think is fair. So reality, you may have said this to your kids. Somebody said it to you. Life isn't fair. It should be. That's another cognitive distortion we'll get to in a second. It should be, but it isn't. And thinking that way, the fallacy of fairness moves you out of reality. The reality being, not everything is fair. Sometimes things aren't fair. And we have to, kind of deal with the reality of what's going on. And from a leadership perspective, I often say, stay with reality. Maybe you feel like things should be fair, but in fact they aren't, so deal with the reality of what you're facing. I mean, this is an issue with social justice issues. Things aren't fair. So what do we do to overcome it? Not necessarily to make it more fair, but to make it more just when the reality is the reality. Deal not with what people should be, deal with the reality and how we can transform people to being in a different way. I mean, that ultimately is what social justice is trying to do. Another thing is double standarding, holding ourselves to a higher standard than others or holding others to a higher standard than us. This comes up in marriages. Usually we hold our spouse to a much higher standard than we hold ourselves. I'm allowed to act emotionally, but not you. Or I'm allowed to get away with this behavior, but not you. Or you may also be too scrupulous and holding yourself to a standard of behavior that other people can't reach. You can find this with pastors who are very oppressive, where basically they look at themselves as being right and being strong and being righteous and all that, and they hold everybody else to it, and they're not recognizing people are struggling. They're not where you are, and they don't see things the way you do. Another is catastrophizing, expecting the worst in all situations, allowing negative emotions to get more weight than they deserve. You know what this is. You know, people who just think the sky is falling. By the way, as we're going through this, you also recognize our church is full of people with all these different thought disorders. That's why there's no they. You know, it's a community of people who are all struggling in one way or another with a particular thought disorder, and your role is not to fix them. But your role is to understand them and yourself in ways that you can choose other ways of responding. Another is blaming or denying. Others are always responsible for my problems, or everything is my fault. And this happens a lot, where they're the problem, this person is the problem, or, I'm the problem. I mean, there are a lot of people in ministry who blame themselves for everything, when in reality, not everything is your fault. Mind reading. This happens a lot, believing that I know what another or others are thinking based on internal beliefs and feelings. This gets into that interpretation where, Alice looks at me in a particular way and I go, oh my God, she's angry at me. And she's thinking I'm a fool. That's mind reading, and we do it all the time. We do it with each other. We can walk into a worship service on Sunday and just look at someone in the pew and mind read. I keep thinking about, so at Calvin Church, we had a retired pastor in our church. I'm not going to name him. He's a wonderful guy, but he had a grouchy face. I mean, he just had a grouchy face. I mean, he just would sit there like, and there are just times, it was very weird because I'd look at him in the middle of a sermon and I'd go, oh my God, he hates everything I'm saying. He thinks I'm a heretic, he's judging me, blah, 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 and he will come through the line and he goes, Graham, that was wonderful. I'm thinking in so many different ways as a result of that. I'm like, wait a second, that's not what your face looks like. But that's being aware of the fact that, by looking at people or their behavior, we can think we understand what they're thinking. Before I go on, just thoughts or questions about any of these. I meant to stop at each slide, but any thoughts or comments or questions about these?
I just told someone the other day that my mom and
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's so important, kind of what Jordan talked about earlier and maybe even Mike, where when you catch yourself mind reading, explore with questions. And that was your comment before also, or your comment about asking why, what's going on underneath it. Because sometimes our bodily behavior does not reflect what we're thinking for a whole variety of reasons. Genetics, injuries, other kinds of situations. What are some other thoughts or comments? Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
I've been aware of the fact that over the years, a lot of people don't even know they do these things.
Yeah.
Until you show them a common list of
Yes.
portions. They say, geez, I didn't know I've been doing that.
Right.
I got to keep that one in mind kind of thing. So bringing them to a sense of awareness is very important.
Yeah, and I think that's,
Criticizing or
yeah. No, just making them aware. I mean, I think that's a lot of the work you do is working with your clients and kind of making them aware, here are some thought distortions. I think some of these things are the way you're interpreting things, yeah.
Not only that, but also helping them recognize it on their own and catch it in the moment.
Yeah.
So that they can do something about it.
Yep, absolutely. I should just get rid of this thing. Let me kind of move forward so I can. Another is emotional reasoning. How I feel is how everything is. We do that a lot. How I feel in the situation is an accurate feeling about everything. And, this happens a lot where, I may not be feeling well, and I walk into a worship service, and I come out of it going, boy, that was a low-energy service. And the weird thing is you can talk to other people and go, gosh, that was just so energizing. But because the way we feel, I think here's an issue that I ran into. So when I was at Calvin Church, we were kind of growing in our service, and so we started a first service. And the whole idea was just to move people from we just were kind of running out of room, but also we wanted it to be more contemplative, to have communion every Sunday, which for Presbyterians is for those of you who come from a more communion-friendly liturgical, what we do is Presbyterians hoard communion. Like if we do it more than 6 times a year, it just cheapens the whole experience. Meanwhile, you talk to a Catholic, Lutheran, or Episcopalian, and they'll go, if you don't have communion, it cheapens the whole worship service. But we, anyway. So what would happen is initially we had like 120 in our second service. We'd have 35 or 40, but periodically that would dip down to maybe 25 or 30, and I'd walk in and I would go, oh crap. Nobody's here. Was there something I said? Was there something wrong? And I had to really train myself, do not respond to the numbers. You give the same energy to 15 people that you would 1,500, but do not respond to them because they are not a reflection on you. Some of them may have been sick. Some of them may be on vacation. Some of them may have had a car breakdown. Some of them may have tried to get their kids to church and it blew up and they decided instead they're just going to the House of Pancakes. We don't know what it is. That low Sunday, otherwise, you would just go through this emotion like Easter is like, everybody loves me. I'm fantastic. And the next week is like, oh my gosh, I'm the worst pastor on the face of the earth. And neither one is true. Another is shoulding. This is what a lot of religious people do. Holding a set of religious standards that everyone and you must follow. This is one of the things I would often do in meetings when people would say, well, people should be like this. And I would just simply say, but they're not. They're not like that. Let's stay with the way they are, not with the way we wish they would be. We are not going back to the past. I don't usually go into a rant, but I do really get across the idea, stay with the reality of the way it is. Don't move into the way everybody should be. Problem is, in religion and denominations, we do a lot of shoulding about everything. In the Presbyterian Book of Order, they deal with it by using the language shall. And what's the other one that's softer than shall in our Book of Order? What? May, yeah. Shall is everybody should. May is, it's okay. We're Episcopalians about this. Over-personalization, a belief that comments and actions are personal when they aren't, and that everything is a reaction to or against me. That also applies to how many people are in worship. Labeling myself and my life in constantly negative terms. Or filtering, seeing people and events only in negative ways or only in positive ways. There are people who will talk about toxic positivity where they only respond in positive ways when you really do need to dig down into the reality. Final thing, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break, is I just want to very quickly go over cognitive restructuring. So how do we reconstruct our thinking? Becoming healthier means seeing our lives, our vocation, others, and the world in a more balanced way that allows for positives, negatives, and everything in between. Basic, I'm going to let you're going to kind of talk about ants or not? Yeah, not in this language, but there's something that a lot of people, the people who do cognitive behavioral therapy recognize that they identify negative or unhealthy schemas or thoughts that harm our lives. They do what's called ant control. Seek out automatic negative thoughts and how they impact our churches. And they also explore automatic negative thoughts and how they impact our relationships, us, our lives, and our leadership. It is helpful to do ant control with yourself. Look at yourself and ask, do I have automatic negative thoughts? You can also ask that of individuals. You can also ask that of a board. Am I leading a board that has automatic negative thoughts? And can I restructure them? Can we look at this in a different way? Which can mean stopping the board meeting. Let's have a discussion on our perspective. Our perspective is one that's not helping us. So can we look at that and be realistic about it? Another is assess more objectively evidence for or against our schemas by stepping outside of ourselves. I had a supervisor when I was working as a drug and alcohol counselor who used to call this, it's important to step out of yourself to another meta level. And what she meant is look at yourself from somewhere outside yourself and try to get an objective perspective of what's going on. Find people to talk about your thoughts with a trusted friend or other who can give you a more objective perspective, which means asking them for a more objective perspective. If you just want to vent and complain, that's not ant control. Venting, now, what you're doing may start out as venting, but it can turn into, so what are you seeing? I mean, I vented, but what are you seeing? Also, seek out a therapist, a life coach, clergy coach, or spiritual director who can help you explore your different ants. And basically, in everything, always ask, is my perspective true? Final thought, intentionally develop a healthy alternative by exploring a new narrative. Asking a question, can I change my story, my schema, my narrative about what I say? Look for alternative models from other people's lives and successes and explore how you might adopt or adapt them to your life. One of my big things is, who do you really respect in life? It can be someone you know, it can be an historical figure, it can be a cultural figure. Go explore what they're doing and how they look at life. If it's somebody you know, talk to them about how they see things. If it's somebody from history, read a biography of them. If it's someone who exists now, read something about them. I do this sometimes with pastors where we will explore who they've really admired in life, and we'll go through what was it that you really like about this person, and how does this impact how you want to be as a pastor. Spend time seeking God's guidance on how to think and be open to ongoing intuitive guidance. So, we're going to take no more than 5 minutes. And we may go a little bit 5 minutes over, but we are trying to stay to that noon time. I'm just giving you that half an hour that we had talked about. So, take a 5-minute break, whatever you need to do, and Rachel's going to chat with us about how she goes about her coaching.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Fagan. Like Graham said, I am Samaritan's life coach. My background is in education. I spent 13 years in public education, went and got certified as a life coach. I then went and got some additional training on what I'm going to talk about here in positive intelligence, which is kind of a synthesis of a lot of the things that we talked about today with some other neuroscience backgrounds and things like that as well. So I just appreciate you sticking with me for our last section of today's workshop. I'll tell you a little bit about how this work that we've talked about today is one of the things that I can do as a life coach and help facilitate people through. So positive intelligence is a program that was created by Shirzad Chamine. He wrote a book called Positive Intelligence. It's a New York Times bestseller. And really, it talks a lot. He did a lot of research and exploration and created this program to really help people with mental fitness. All right, and so a lot of the things we've talked about today are parts of mental fitness as well. We, spend a lot of time in our culture talking about getting to the gym and working on our physical fitness, but our mental fitness is also really important as well. And so that's the work that he has taken on. And in this, it's really about growing 3 core mental muscles to help you thrive in challenging times. So the definition of mental fitness is really your capacity to be able to respond to life's challenges with a positive or beneficial rather than negative or detrimental mindset. And the impact of this type of work can really help with your performance, your peace of mind, your well-being, your happiness. and your relationships. Those are like the 3 areas that have had the biggest impact on this program that I can coach people through or teach people about, even if it's not through the program. The program I'm talking about today, I'm not going to go in a whole lot of detail about like the specifics of the program. I'm still going to go into just mostly about what we've been talking about and how this is related. The language is a little bit different, but hopefully you can make the connections. I'll try to make the connections as well. But the program I'm talking about is actually an app-guided program that has daily activities and stuff, plus coaching worked in addition to the app-guided education and exercises. So I have clients who do the app. I have clients who do the app and coaching. I have clients who don't do anything with this, but we talk about some of these concepts and we just do traditional life coaching skills as well. So there's a whole lot of different opportunities, but I really love this program. So when I'm talking about the program, more than likely I'm talking about the app-guided 7-week program, and then a lot of people then go into coaching after that, after they have some foundations of what this whole workshop has been about. So there is a research. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details. If you're interested, you can email me and I can send you the information I have about the research. But it is a synthesis of neuroscience, the cognitive behavioral therapy, performance science, positive psychology. There's emotional intelligence involved. There's all kinds of things involved in the research of this program as well. And if you know anything about factor analysis, the results of this program are results of factor analysis research. Basically, factor analysis is when you kind of try to find the root cause or the core thing and simplify a system down into basic things. So, example, for colors, the whole spectrum of colors, the factor analysis of colors is there's 3 primary colors, right? So it just kind of breaks it down. In positive intelligence or in mental fitness, they have brought it down to 3 core muscles that are the root of mental fitness, and that is your ability to intercept what we call your saboteurs. In my world, saboteurs are your negative thought patterns, okay? So it's a saboteur. Activate SAGE, which is the wise part of your brain. I mean, I could go on for hours about this. I'm not going to do that today. But even going back to the brain diagram that Graham showed you, I mean, there's different parts of the brain that are activated with all of these. And then working on the self-command, intercepting that negative thought, creating some space in between, allowing you to access a different part of your brain that gives you a wiser or more beneficial response, and then commanding your brain to do it. Okay, so that's what this whole program is designed, and that's what I also do in some of my coaching sessions. So I said we call these saboteurs in the positive intelligence world, and basically we all have them. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. So these are not exactly the cognitive distortions, but they're related to the cognitive distortions. So you will see some connections there. This is not in you don't have a slide deck for this, okay? So it turns out there are 10 saboteurs that we all have. We all carry around them at all times, but we tend to default to only using a couple of them. We have some favorites, if you will. And then we also have access to our 5 SAGE powers. Empathy was one of those. So I was really excited when you brought that up because that is a big part of this work when you're putting it into action. The interesting thing about this is to understand that we're driven by both of these regions of the brain and when we synthesize them together. I'll tell you a little bit more about the specific ones in a minute, but we're going to talk about the first part of it, which is the saboteur interceptor. So the first whole part of the program is being able to recognize, I have these saboteur thought patterns, and here's where they're showing up. And the thing is, they're really tricky. They are really tricky. Some of them are really camouflaged and things like, oh, I had no idea that was really that coming out, and it showed up in this way. And so the whole first couple of weeks is learning to just recognize it and just stop it. And then we'll get into these other things in a second. So the biggest, probably most detrimental saboteur that we all carry is the judge. And this is your judge of yourself, your judge of others, and your judge of circumstance. And people can experience the judge very differently. The creator of the program, Shirzad, he has a very angry, volatile judge. He did a demonstration of what like his thought process was in the program, and like just how mean and degrading when his judge shows up in his brain. It is loud. It is awful. Mine's more of like a condescending parent. It's a little bit softer, but when my judge, so I mean everybody experiences it differently, and then my judge of self kind of shows up one way, my judge of others shows up a little bit different, my judge of the circumstances a little bit different. So just recognizing, getting really familiar of how these different saboteurs show up for yourself. And like I said, you might notice it differently in different situations. The judge is pretty bad on its own, but here's the thing. The judge doesn't usually come alone. He brings in what we call the accomplice saboteurs, all right? So a lot of our negative thoughts start with the judge and then brings on these friends that just do even more damage. So the accomplice saboteurs, which I am not, for time's sake, going to go into a whole lot of detail about this, but I'll give you a little bit of a summary of them. So this is kind of hard to see, but the first one in the upper left-hand corner is the controller. So, let me just back up a little bit. So we all have these things, and before I go into some of this, some of you might be thinking, well, like that's actually helpful, right? Some of these things are like really good and like help me be successful. Yeah, that is true. The problem is when we overuse them, or we apply them to situations where they just don't make sense. Saboteurs are rooted in our survival part of our brain. I mean, that's how we were wired. It's our easiest access wiring, right? It's either your fight or flight, a lot of it. The problem is we don't always strengthen the muscles of the sage pieces of our brain because we default, it's just sometimes just easier to activate the saboteur, and we don't know how to even access those other options. So when I explain some of these, know when I'm talking about the problems with it, I'm talking about when we overuse them or we abuse them or we're applying them to a situation that just doesn't make sense. So the controller has a need to confront and dominate, confrontational, not open to influence. Hyperachiever, narrow focus on achievement to the detriment of your relationships, balanced perspective. Restless, constant need for busyness, rarely at peace with the current activity, spread too thin, follow through suffers. Stickler, that's your stereotypical perfectionist. And perfectionism is applied to too many things, causes anxiety and discouragement. Self-critical, often disappointed with others. Pleaser is your people pleaser. Constantly helping, pleasing, rescuing others, hoping to be liked, losing sight of your own needs and becoming resentful as a result. Hypervigilant is definitely rooted in fear. Safety is its objective at all times. Too anxious, always expecting the worst, worried about too many things rather than focusing on the few that truly matter. Avoider, that's your procrastinator, or just staying away from difficult or unpleasant tasks or conflicts. Victim, you see some of these are overlapping. Continuous focus on painful and deflating emotions. Temperamental as a way to gain attention. And hyper-rational is excessive reliance on the rational function in dealing with people and emotions. Hurts relationships by not being empathetic or considering emotions. So there's a whole lot more. Also recognize there's a whole underlying sage strength to every single one of these, okay? So it's just when we overuse them or not use them appropriately that they can become problematic. So in the program, Shirzad and his team created a saboteur assessment. That's one of the first things we do. Even if people aren't doing the program, sometimes I like my clients to do this anyway because it gives me some insight to what's going on. And it's a free assessment that you can actually see which one of your accomplice saboteurs tends to show up the most powerfully or the most frequently. So this is just an example. Personally, my hypervigilant was the one that was my number one saboteur, but what's interesting is it doesn't happen very often. But when it does, when I get hijacked by my hypervigilant, it is the most powerful one. It's the one that just I shut down on. Like that is the one that is the hardest one for me to work through. But the ones that show up every day are my controller and my stickler. Those are the ones that I'm dealing with every single day. They're a little bit softer. So even though, we interpret this assessment based on the frequency and how powerful. But there's an assessment that goes with this. And the idea behind having this assessment is if you can know exactly where your saboteurs are in addition to your judge, you have a better opportunity to intercept them, stop them, and then choose something different. So that is why this assessment exists. Again, here's some more information about those different saboteurs that I kind of already went through. So both are motivating, your saboteurs and your sage, but they motivate from a different place. Saboteurs tend to motivate you through negative emotions, things like fear, stress, anger, guilt, shame, insecurity, all things that don't feel good. But your sage motivates you through positive emotions, things like empathy, curiosity, creativity, passion, and purpose. All right? Both can generate success, but sage feels better while you do it, okay? Saboteur is not going to help you feel happy in the process. So that is, in this program, we kind of teach you how to choose for yourself and hopefully feel better. So the question then is, well, wait a minute, aren't these negative emotions good for you? Because sometimes you just said they were motivating, right? Okay. Some people, I mean, I know when I first went through, I did the program as a participant first before I got trained to coach people in it. And so I struggled with some of this stuff myself because I was working on it myself. I really thought my perfectionism was really helpful. It is, to an extent, but there comes a point when it becomes very detrimental. So this is one of the first things we have to challenge when we go through some of this work. But let me talk a little bit more about this. So aren't negative emotions good for you? Well, is pain good for you? All right?
It lets you know there's something amiss going on.
If you leave your hand on a hot stove, after your brain has already said, hey, dummy, your hand is burning, is that good? No. That is what our saboteurs do, though. It's like leaving your hand on the hot stove. Instead of doing what the pain receptor is supposed to do, is saying, hey, dummy, take your hand off of that stove and choose a different action, right? So it's good for you in a sense that it's a signal to take corrective action and choose differently. But what happens is we get stuck in saboteur, and we keep our hands on that hot stove. Or we think it's helping us. If I have this constant reminder of how terrible I am, then it's going to motivate me to do something different, right? Okay, yeah, maybe, but there are other ways to motivate you to do something different that feel a little bit better than keeping your hand on that hot stove, right? They're only helpful for a second as an alert. I'm just kind of going to go through this a little bit. So the first part is we teach people to recognize what saboteurs you gravitate to and intercept them. Then we got to get you to activate your sage part. The sage part, it lives in the region of the brain that you associate with positivity, peace, calmness, clarity, creativity, big picture. It's operating from what we call the sage perspective. And like I mentioned before, there is a contagion effect for both of these. If you are in saboteur mode, what do you think the people you're interacting with are going to be reflecting? Same thing. Your saboteurs can trigger other people's saboteurs. Your sage can also activate other people's sage. Now, I will tell you just kind of a funny story. I had my husband do this program as well, right? It has really helped our communication, except for in the moment when I'm fired up about something and he calls out my saboteurs. He has learned, that is not, no, wait, even though you'll start to recognize other people's saboteurs, I don't recommend calling them out on it in the moment, especially if they have no idea what you're talking about. We now have a language that helps us work through some of that marital conflict that every relationship has. But we've had to work through some of that too, because there have been times when I've said, whoa, hold on, I need to take a minute. I have not created enough space to activate my sage right now for you to be able to talk to me like that, because this is just not going to go well, right? So The sage perspective, and again, this is like 99% of the time. There are extreme cases here, but the sage perspective is really that every outcome or circumstance can be turned into a gift or an opportunity. That doesn't mean it should be. So kind of going back to what your question was about, validating feelings, and it doesn't mean it should, all right? But it's understanding that in 99% of the situations you're in, the sage perspective is that it can be converted into a gift or an opportunity. Sometimes that's just accepting this is it, right? I'm just going to accept this for what it is. Sometimes it's converting it into something else. Sage wants to keep you in those, saboteur wants to keep you in those bad feelings, all right? In that bad, angry state, unpleasant, fearful state. Going back. So when I first saw this, I didn't really buy into it. I will tell you just a really quick story about myself. When I was younger, I was really into gymnastics, loved it. I wasn't very good at it, but I thought I was, really, really liked it. I had a fracture in my spine that immediately ended, not because of a gymnastics move or anything. I just had a deformed spine, and I immediately ended up my career. I was crushed. I was absolutely crushed. I had created an identity at 12 years old around this sport that I thought I was good at. Devastating. At the time, I wasn't able to accept it or convert it into a gift or opportunity. But you know what? When I had to stop, I took up music. Some of you know me as a musician. This is where my life work is. This is where my work with God is. This is my ministry. I am a music minister. Like, that is just part of my work. I don't know that I ever would have explored that part of me had I not had that gymnastics injury. So again, not at the time, but I have learned to, even in my hardest situations, be open to the fact that someday I may choose to convert this into a gift or an opportunity, and I have no idea what that is even going to be at this point. So again, just another perspective. I'm going to skip this for a minute. So then we go into the self-command. But before we do that, one of the key components of the program is what we call PQ reps. PQ is positive intelligence. And these are really sensory awareness type things. So you recognize you've gotten triggered by something, your saboteurs are on high alert, they're ready to do whatever that is, whatever their response is, and you've recognized, like, I want something different. First thing you have to do is create space, because you can't just shift into sage. It just doesn't work. So one of the easiest ways to do that is through some sort of sensory awareness activity. And we have a whole bunch of different strategies. For time's sake, I'm not going to run through them right now, but pretty much things like, close your eyes, and can you hear the furthest sound away from you right now? For 10 seconds, just try to find the furthest sound away. Or maybe it's the closest sound. Maybe it's the sound of your breath. My favorite one in traffic jams, when I'm getting really angry at the people who don't know how to drive around here. Some of these, are a little more, I'm not going to close my eyes while I'm driving, but can you find every single one of your toes? Can you wiggle each one? That one that's right before the pinky one's kind of hard. It irritates me. But you get really focused on something else that's not whatever triggered you. You're really forcing yourself to focus on that one toe I can't figure out how to wiggle. Or rubbing your two fingers together. You can do this under a table during a session meeting or whatever. Can you feel all the ridges in your fingertips? Tune everything else out, and you'll get distracted, and it won't work for the first 100 times you do this. Can you do it for 10 seconds? Can you do it for 10 more? 10 seconds at a time. This is where that space gets created. You're de-escalating the saboteur, and you're starting to be able to open your pathway into the sage perspective. There's a whole bunch more, but for time's sake, I will not go into that. Hold on, I'm not following my... Once you've created some space using the PQ reps, you can then further weaken the saboteur by incorporating different SAGE step strategies. So each one of these saboteurs has a different strategy that in the moment you can use to further de-escalate. So like for controller, the question, if you recognize, when I recognize the controller is really activated, I'm ready to like take charge of the situation, very authoritarian or authoritative. The question I ask is, what might make this more of a pull? What might make this more of an invitation? Here, I have a strong need to want to exert something. How can I invite something instead? Instead of push, I want to pull. For stickler, so that's your perfectionist. Which bucket does this belong into? 80% of the things can be good enough, right? 20% of the things in life probably should be more perfect, right? Which bucket? That just kind of neutralizes it. Which bucket is this particular thing I'm getting worked up about? Which one does that really need to belong in? Simplicity of the operating system, again, once we work on some of that, here's how it works. You're feeling the negative emotion, you're going to stop. You're recognizing you're in saboteur mode. We're activating that interceptor. Do some PQ reps to quiet the saboteurs and activate that SAGE, creating that space in between. Assume the SAGE perspective, if you are able to in that moment, that every problem can be converted into a gift or opportunity, even if all that means is I'm accepting it for now. I'm just accepting it for this moment. I'll think about it later. And then generating the gift by using one of the SAGE powers, like empathy, curiosity, creativity, clear-headed action. So each one of the saboteurs has its own like de-escalation, but then there are SAGE powers, which is empathy, explore, navigate, innovate, and action. And basically, those are the SAGE steps. Those are the SAGE powers that you can use to choose better, to choose wiser, to choose happier, to choose more productive. There are different strategies that I teach clients, and through the program you can teach to access these different things. So the question, is it really possible to just shift from saboteur to SAGE, even in tough challenges? Yeah. But when we go through the program, we start small. We start with the small challenges. You don't want to go to the gym for the first time ever and pick up the 200-pound dumbbell, right? No, you're going to start with the little 2-pound weights here. So again, that's part of the coaching process with me. The reason I got into this was because I was finding that I wanted something in between sessions for my clients to keep working. Because we've all been to conferences where we're like, oh, this is great, I'm pumped up, fired up, and then we go home and like, we're back to the same environment. We forget half the energy, and like there's just nothing in between. I wanted something that could help keep people working on it daily, actively. So the program is designed for 15 minutes of a day, 6 to 8 weeks. I'm not going to bore you with the details about it, but that's just a little bit about my work with positive intelligence, which is one of the services that I offer through coaching.
As we close, several things. Well, number one, what Rachel just said. A large part of why we do this workshop and others is to help pastors and leaders develop different understandings to help your leadership. But it's also recognizing that we are a resource for you. Rachel is our life coach. If all the stuff she was talking about, if you kind of recognize I'm caught between SAGE and saboteur, contact us, and Rachel is not only able to work with you, but she's wonderful in working with you, because I know this because I'm her supervisor and I get to hear what she does, and it really is incredible stuff. The positive intelligence, Beth, I apologize, hope this is okay, but Beth even ran through it herself. Our director of marketing and development ran through it herself and came out of it and was like, this was fantastic, this was wonderful. But also, this is the work I do in addition to being executive director, and it's a huge part of my coming to Samaritan, is working with pastors, working with churches to nurture better leadership, to create healthier churches. We also have Amy Armanius, who's also one of our spiritual directors, in addition to me, who also is trained in working on the spiritual side. But the other thing, too, is we've actually put together a team of 4 therapists who we are, over time, training to work specifically with pastors. They are not pastors themselves, but they are coming from a background where, before becoming therapists, they worked in HR. That before becoming a therapist, they worked in business as a leader in business. We have one of these pastors, Bob Fisher, who is the executive director for 28 years of the Staunton Clinic and pretty much understands every single conflict situation out there. It's just recognizing that, for whatever, if this sparks you to want to go further in working on yourself, we have resources to actually help you with that. So I would invite you. You can contact me. You can go to our website, find Amy. You can find Rachel. Or you can call our front number and they'll put you through. So just want you to be aware of that. Anyway, I do want to thank you all so much for taking part of the day here and being with us. And I really hope that this is helpful for you and that you'll remember we are a resource for you. So I'm going to close with a prayer, but thank you very much. Yes, hold the applause. Holy and gracious God, I pray that your blessings will be upon everybody here and just be a guide, a spirit, a blessing, a light, a love, everything in helping us become better leaders to lead transformation that leads people to you. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. And thank you.